Mic check 1 2. Mic check 1 2 from the witness table. Mic check 1 2 3 4 5 6 7 8. Mic check from the witness table. Mic check 1 2.
Did you put the mole box? Okay, then check it from there. You have a mic? You have a headphone? Headphone? Oh. It's already broken. This thing la. Yeah, midi chiulsa. God. Test 1 2 3 1 2 3 1 2 3. Jigngisum, Jigngisum. 1 2 3 1 2 3. Nem. This go. 1 2 3. Kama choose ne nem da. 1 2 3 1 2 3. 1 2 3. One, two, three, 1 2 3. 1 2 3 1 2 3. 1 2 3. 1 2 3 1 2 3. Okay, good.
so we can sit up top if we want. But we're almost. Okay, I will try to get today. After she testifies, we'll take off.
We haven't witnesses as they're not here yet. Sure, that's correct. Yes,
One more. Let's do one more. One, two, three. Great. Thank you.
Is this it? You're here? This is. Okay. Are we ready? So good morning and welcome to a joint hearing of the Congressional-Executive Commission on China and the Tom Lantos Human Rights Commission, hosted by the House Foreign Affairs Committee. And I want to thank my co-chair, Senator Marco Rubio, on the China Commission, and Congressman Chris Smith, my co-chair on the Tom Lantos Human Rights Commission. I would also like to thank Chairman Elliot Engel and Ranking Member Michael McCall and all the members of the Foreign Affairs Committee for hosting and participating in this important hearing. The title of today's hearing is Tiananmen at 30, Examining the Evolution of Repression in China. The hearing will review the events in China in 1989, the aspirations of the Tiananmen generation, and the ongoing censorship and lack of accountability for those seeking answers about the victims of the massacre. For our first panel, we are proud to welcome the Speaker of the House of Representatives, Nancy Pelosi. In 1989, just 2 weeks after the Tiananmen Square massacre, Nancy Pelosi, then in her second term in Congress, introduced legislation to protect Chinese students and nationals who feared being deported back to China. The eventual Chinese Student Protection Act passed into law and ultimately granted legal permanent resident status to approximately 53,000 Chinese nationals, thereby boosting our economy and contributing to the wonderful diversity of our country. Two beneficiaries of this legislation were Weishan Jin and Li Shen. Weishan was a researcher in a genetics lab. Li was a student in accounting. Their son Peter is now a police officer in Salt Lake City. And we are proud that their daughter Sophie Jin serves her country on the China Commission staff. The legislation that welcomes Sophie and her family into our country is the best of what America has to offer. And I want to thank Speaker Pelosi for that. In 1991, in Tiananmen Square, under the glare of the security cameras and the spotlight of Chinese police, Nancy Pelosi unfurled a banner that read, and I quote, "To those who died for democracy in China," end quote. To this day, that act of compassion is often mentioned by Chinese dissidents, some of whom heard about it when they were in prison. Back in Congress, Pelosi was organizing. She founded and chaired the Bipartisan Congressional Working Group on China with Congressman Frank Wolf. She spearheaded the effort to condition China's most favored nation's trade status on progress on releasing pro-democracy demonstrators. And throughout the 1990s, Nancy Pelosi took on both Republican and Democratic presidents. When permanent normal trade relations, PNTR, for China was considered, Pelosi led the opposition, stating that PNTR should only be granted after, not before, the Chinese government implemented its trade commitments. If only the Congress followed her lead on that vote. And throughout her 30 years of advocacy for the people of China and Tibet, she fought for the release of a countless number of political prisoners. And any Chinese government official who meets with her, especially Chinese presidents, can expect to receive a letter with political prisoners that should be released. Pelosi sponsored legislation to award the Congressional Gold Medal to His Holiness the Dalai Lama. She represented the U.S. at the Nobel Peace Prize ceremony for Chinese democracy leader Liu Xiaobo. She led the way to provide U.S. assistance for Tibetan refugees and pushed back against World Bank projects that harmed the environment and the people of China and Tibet. And I was proud to join the Pelosi-led congressional delegations to India, Hong Kong, China, and Tibet to support human rights. We're proud to have Speaker Pelosi here today to share her thoughts and expertise on the Tiananmen Square massacre, human rights in China and Tibet, and the role of Congress. We welcome you, Madam Speaker, and the floor is yours.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. As you know, it is unusual for the Speaker of the House to testify before a committee. This is more than a committee. It's a committee, a commission, so many things. Thank you for your leadership as chair of the Lantos Commission and the Human Rights Commission, as well as your role with the China Commission. And thank you, co-chairman Rubio, for your extraordinary leadership, as well as Mr. Chairman Smith, whom I've worked with for decades on this issue. Thank you, Mr. Chairman Engel, for your leadership on the Foreign Affairs Committee, and to all of you, thank you for being here this morning. And I accept the kind remarks and overly generous introduction that you gave me on behalf of our many colleagues. Anything you said I did, we did in a bipartisan way. including unfurling that banner in Tiananmen Square in a bipartisan way. And all of the legislation to protect the Chinese students of issues that related to trade and human rights in China in a bipartisan way, right, Mr. Smith? All along the way. And I want to acknowledge, while we were in Tiananmen Square unfurling a banner for which we were chased by the People's Liberation Army, it was just a question of who could run faster. Mr. Levin was actually in Tiananmen Square at the time of the massacre. Thank you for the beautiful testimony and the photos that you have of that occasion, which was an assault on humanity, in my view. So I thank you all for focusing on this special anniversary. And sitting here with Wei Kaixi, when we had our first hearing after Tiananmen Square, our very first hearing, Wei Kaixi was our first guest. Remember that way. And now we are 30 years later. Here he is, so courageous all these years, but so courageous then. Thank you, Wei, for being here. Again, as a founding member of the CECC Commission and Speaker of the House, and as an American, I'm honored to speak at this Tiananmen at 30, examining the evolution of repression in China. Today, we remember the brutal massacre that the Chinese government committed against its own people 30 years ago. We remember the courage of the students, workers, and citizens who peacefully defied an oppressive regime to demand the liberties and human rights that they deserved. We all remember that they raised the goddess of democracy in the image of our own Statue of Liberty, how they quoted our founders, how the tanks and troops crushed their protest but could not extinguish the flame of freedom burning in their hearts. 30 years later, one of the enduring images of the 20th century remains seared into our shared conscience, a lone man standing in the street bringing a line of tanks to a grinding halt. I was sad to learn years later, going back to China, that most students in the universities and the rest have no idea of that image. When they're asked what they think it stands for, they say, well, is it an ad for something? Is it an ad for a drink, a soda, or something like that? The Chinese have totally suppressed what happened at Tiananmen Square, as well as the lone man standing before the tank, revered in the whole world, but unknown to young people in China. Earlier this year, the Tiananmen mothers, God bless them, who lost loved ones in the massacre, wrote to Chinese leaders, and this is what the moms said. They said, during the great famine of the 1950s and 60s, in which tens of millions of our compatriots starved to death, the former Chinese president, Liu Xiaoji, warned Mao Zedong, people are eating people, it will be written in the books. That's what the mom said in this letter, this current letter. Considering this, they said, we can't help but wonder, wouldn't the People's Liberation Army's mass killing of innocent people in full public view also be recorded in history in the end? Today and on all days, we assure these mothers that we remember and that the heroism of their children will continue to be written in the official history of the United States Congress. We must remember because China still tries to deny history. As the writer Liu Xiong wrote, lies written in ink cannot disguise facts written in blood. I remember June 4th vividly, the horrors of the massacre and the heroism of the massacred. They remain with many of us until today. On June 21st, just over 2 weeks after the Tiananmen Square massacre, in a bipartisan way, we introduced the Emergency Chinese Immigration Relief Act to help Chinese students facing persecution stay in America, followed by the Chinese Student Protection Act, again, in a bipartisan way. This was important because the Chinese were filming all the demonstrations in the United States so that they would be able to punish the students who participated, not in China, but in here, in the United States, reaching their hand into deterring free expression in the United States of America. 2 years after the massacre, as you indicated, Democrats and Republicans stood in Tiananmen Square and furled a black and white banner reading, "To those who died for democracy in China." And then we got chased by the People's Liberation Army. What was interesting about it, you might want to know, is when we were there and people saw Americans there, and all of what looked like tourists were being friendly and smiling and this or that. When we took out the banner, all those friendly tourists had walkie-talkies, and they were calling the police. So they were police themselves, calling the People's Liberation Army. They came out of the building. We could see the troops coming. We took off, and they did manage to assault some of our members, take the film from photographers and the rest. But nonetheless, the statement was made. And every year since, we have argued in a bipartisan way that America and the world cannot afford to promote a morally bankrupt policy toward China. Sadly, 30 years after Tiananmen, we see that China has changed, but its record of repression has not. From the unabated abuse and repression of the Uyghurs faced in the hands of the Chinese government, to the plight of people of Hong Kong, where the Chinese-controlled council pushes an extradition bill that makes mockery of the one country, two systems pledge and would put 85,000 U.S. citizens at risk, to the decades-long abuse faced by the Tibetan people, whose religion, culture, and language the Chinese government is brutally trying to erase, and to prison cells on the mainland where journalists, human rights lawyers, democracy activists, and Christians are denied dignity, justice, and their rights. If we do not speak out for human rights in China because of economic concerns, we lose all moral authority to talk about human rights in any other place in the world. Human rights and trade are inextricably linked. That is why in 1993 we worked together on the U.S. China Act to tie any extension of China's trade status to improvements in human rights by the Chinese government. In 1994, we urged our colleagues in Congress to limit most favored nation status on products made by the People's Liberation Army, the very perpetrators of the massacre in Tiananmen Square. In 1999, we warned that the Chinese government had signed agreements on trade, on proliferation, on human rights, but had not honored them. And in 2000, we all worked together to fight efforts to give China a blank check while China gave the U.S. a rubber check by failing to comply with its market commitments under the World Trade Organization. As I said then, the U.S.-China bilateral WTO agreement is seriously deficient in substance, implementation, and enforcement. This issue is too important for our economy to be based on a pattern of broken promises, not proven performance. Today, let us recognize the greatest tribute Congress can make to the fallen freedom fighters of Tiananmen is to use our influence to advance the democratic aspirations of that generation. Mr. Chairman, so many chairmen there. They say that if you're in prison, one of the most excruciating forms of punishment that can be exacted upon you is to say that nobody remembers you, they don't remember why you're here or that you are here in prison. And we want to be sure that those prisoners know, and we do believe that the message gets to them, that they are not forgotten, that in the Congress of the United States, important leaders such as all of you gathered here are saying their names, giving letters to the authorities in China, recognizing their sacrifice, which is a sacrifice not just for them personally, but a sacrifice for democracy throughout the world. In the 212, Congress made clear that trade and human rights are firmly linked, passing Chairman McGovern's Magnitsky Rule of Law Accountability Act as part of the Russia PNTR. In 2017, we built on that progress by making the Magnitsky Act global. Thank you, Mr. Chairman, for that, and thank all of you who participated in that. Last year, we passed the Bipartisan Tibet Reciprocity Act, also led by Chairman McGovern, to hold China accountable for its repression of the Tibetan people. As we work on trade agreements today, we continue to insist that any policy be tied to human rights. America must demonstrate the moral courage to use our leverage to not only guarantee fair trade for our products in Chinese markets, but also to advance human rights in China. Let me repeat. We cannot allow economic interest with China to blind us to the moral injustices committed by China. And I asked on the House floor 20 years ago during the PNTR debate, what does it profit a country if it gains the whole world and suffers the loss of its soul? Just over 10 years ago, Liu Xiaobo, the world's great champion of human rights, whose death was an affront to the very identity of human dignity, the very idea of human dignity, penned Charter 08. In that text, he asked, where is China headed in the 21st century? Will it continue its modernization under authoritarian rule, or will it embrace universal human rights, join the mainstream of civilized nations, and build a democratic system? Mr. Smith and I and others were honored to represent Liu Xiaobo when he received the Nobel Peace Prize in Norway. Of course, the Chinese would not let him out of the country. The prize was given to an empty chair, but we were honored to be part of the delegation to show our support and our concern. As we examine the evolution of repression today, let us continue to work to achieving Liu Xiaobo's dream and the dream of the Tiananmen protesters, a future of freedom for all. Thank you all for the opportunity to testify today. Thank each and every one of you for your leadership, your commitment to human rights and advancing freedoms in China. And that, of course, includes Tibet and Hong Kong, Beijing, with the Uyghurs and the rest. So much repression is taking place. I think we're going in the opposite direction. It's important for the world to know 30 years later that we haven't forgotten what happened then and that we know what is happening now and that it will have an impact in our relationship with China. I thank you all for your leadership and for the opportunity to share some thoughts with you today.
Well, thank you very much, Madam Speaker, and on behalf of all of us here. We are grateful to you. I just want to point out to you, just as we're speaking right now, that someone just gave me a picture of a candlelight vigil in Victoria Square in Hong Kong, where tens of thousands of people are doing a candlelight vigil in honor of those who lost their lives in Tiananmen Square and other uprisings all around China. So this is happening as we speak. So thank you very much. And I know you have a very busy schedule. I think the Senator, I'll yield to Senator Rubio.
Thank you, and thank you, Madam Speaker, for being here on this important day. Thank you to the Chairman for convening this important Commission hearing on the 30th anniversary.
And I think you can.
Well, let me just thank you for showing that picture of what's happening in Hong Kong, because that's the only place in China where people are able to speak out. It's a beautiful sight to behold, and I commend the courage of the people there for speaking out in light of China's actions in Hong Kong these days. And thank you again, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you very much. And now I'm happy to yield to our co-chair, Senator Rubio.
Thank you again. And I do want to begin by welcoming our witnesses, and I look forward to their testimony, their firsthand recollections of this watershed event of 1989, the policy recommendations that you have for Congress that we should consider. I think today's anniversary will remind us that the fundamental human yearning for dignity and human rights and basic rights is not limited to any one region or limited to one country or limited to one culture. These aspirations have transcended geography and culture throughout the history of man. Today we honor the lives that were irrevocably altered by the events of that day, those who perished, those who were imprisoned and tortured, those who lost mothers, fathers, sons, and daughters, and those whose loved ones remain missing and unaccounted for. Tiananmen must not be viewed exclusively through the lens of history. Rather, today we must also reckon with the ongoing systematic human rights abuses committed by the Chinese Communist Party and the Chinese government against its own people. And we must reckon with the emerging and new geopolitical competition between tyranny and liberty, between democracy and totalitarianism. To reflect briefly on the events that led up to that fateful day, in the spring of 1989, thousands of students gathered at the center of Beijing to mourn the death of a prominent reformer within the Communist Party who wanted to move China towards a more open and democratic political system. And in the days that followed, thousands would gather in Tiananmen Square to call for greater freedoms and political reforms and to protest the repressive policies. Their numbers grew as the days passed, not only in Beijing, but also in 400 cities and universities across the nation, until more than 1 million people, that included journalists and workers, government employees and police, joined the students and echoed their demands. And then late in the evening of the 3rd of June and into the 4th, China's People's Liberation Army, acting on the orders of the Chinese Communist Party, responded with brute force and lethal violence, opening fire on peaceful demonstrators. To this day, the precise number of resulting casualties is unknown. There has been no public accounting of the events of that week, and there has been, of course, no justice for the victims. Rather, those that seek to commemorate the event or seek information about those killed, like the Tiananmen mothers, are harassed, they are detained, they are arrested. Perhaps the most iconic image associated with the Tiananmen Massacre is Tank Man, the small, solitary figure with shopping bags in hand who stood in the path of an advancing line of tanks. Tank Man remains an enigma. We don't know his fate. Some believe he was imprisoned, others believe he was executed. There are some who still hope that he's alive today. We don't know. But while the names of many of the Tiananmen protesters are now lost to history and to the Chinese government's Orwellian memory hole, the bravery of protesters in the face of certain danger reminds us that the principles of freedom, democracy, and self-rule are not just American principles. They are human principles that neither tank treads, nor torture, nor terror can erase, not even by the Communist Party of China. Principles that I believe still remain the quiet hope and aspiration of many people in that ancient and noble nation. The U.S., the nations of the free world, should demand that the Chinese government allow open discussion on the events of that day and the enforced amnesia of the Tiananmen Square massacre in China, online, at Confucius Institutes here in the United States that operate on our college campuses and globally as well. Unconditionally release those detained or imprisoned for attempting to commemorate the anniversary, and reckon publicly with the horrific violence experienced by the Chinese people at the hands of the party and the military. And we must continue to use opportunities like this, Mr. Chairman, and I thank you for calling this hearing, because we must continue to use opportunities like this to speak about the true story of the Tiananmen Square massacre. This point is important because Tiananmen revealed to the world the true nature of the Communist Party in China. For decades, successive U.S. administrations tried to pursue constructive engagement. The bipartisan conventional wisdom wrongly assumed that trade, investment, and other engagement would eventually persuade Beijing to embrace and accept liberty and respect for human rights, and that optimism was misplaced. Today, we see an increasingly aggressive Chinese Communist government that is more repressive in domestic policies, more mercantilist in trade and economic policy, increasingly dismissive of all international norms, and more assertive in exporting their authoritarian model globally. While Chinese government-sponsored repression looks much different today than it did 30 years ago, the goal remains exactly the same: to preserve the Communist Party monopoly on domestic political power through state-sponsored indoctrination, through mass surveillance, through arbitrary detention, torture, violence. The Communist Party today in China is using technology to stay in power, whether in the emerging social credit systems or the vast digital surveillance states and accompanying internment camps, to transform the religious and ethnic identities of millions of Uyghurs and other Muslim ethnic minorities in Xinjiang. Data-driven surveillance facilitated by iris and body scanners, voice pattern analyzers, DNA sequencers, and facial recognition cameras in neighborhoods, on roads, in train stations. Technology, by the way, that they export into other countries. Sounds like science fiction, but it's happening. In the era of high-tech social control, there is a direct line of repression linking the Tank Man and the internment of over 1 million Uyghurs and other predominantly Muslim minorities in what they call political re-education camps. And just over the weekend, Twitter, a global company that isn't even allowed to operate in China, suspended the accounts of reportedly more than 100 Chinese language users critical of the government, coincidentally just ahead of this anniversary. We must also keep American companies accountable for their potential complicity in Chinese government censorship and other abuses. And so I hope that the time has come for the U.S. to once again lead, along with the rest of the free world, in holding the Chinese government accountable for its ongoing blatant repression of the Chinese people. We must stand with the oppressed Tibetan Buddhist monk, the silenced human rights lawyer, the imprisoned Christian pastor, the disappeared Uyghur Muslim, the disillusioned Hong Kong democracy activist, and countless others living under the repressive policies of the Chinese government. To do anything else dishonors the spirit of Tiananmen. It tarnishes the memory of those lost and places us on the wrong side of history. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Senator. Thank you for your powerful statement. You know, it was 30 years ago this week that an estimated 1 million Chinese students, workers, and citizens joined the peaceful protests in Tiananmen Square and in over 400 cities throughout China. The people of China were calling for an open dialogue with government officials about corruption, the acceleration of economic and political reform, and the protection of human rights. We remember with sadness and outrage the crackdown that followed as the People's Liberation Army was unleashed on its own people. Some of you in this room were in Tiananmen Square on that day 30 years ago. We know you took great risks. We know you lost friends. And we know you have sacrificed so much in the years since to advance democracy and support the human rights and dignity of all the people of China. I want to thank you for all of your leadership and for your advocacy. One of the most inspiring images in history, as Senator Rubio pointed out, was that lone man standing in the street before the line of tanks on Tiananmen Square. We may never know the name of the tank man, but his act of resistance symbolizes the spirit of Tiananmen that lives on in the hearts and minds of those continuing the struggle in China and abroad. You know, in China, the Tiananmen Mothers is a group of relatives and friends of those killed in June 1989. At risk to themselves, at great risk to themselves, they continue to ask for the right to mourn publicly and call for a full public and independent accounting of all the victims. Ding Xiaoling, the 82-year-old founder of the group, lost her 17-year-old son on that day. Chinese authorities have tried to intimidate and silence her in advance of the 30th anniversary. Official surveillance never ends for her, as she is followed by Chinese security officers every single day. The government fears her memory, her devotion, and her moral standing. In the years since Tiananmen, the human rights situation in China has worsened. Tiananmen was a key turning point as the country moved from the brink of openness and reform to new and evolving methods of repression, including against the Tibetan and Uyghur peoples. Some have described a slow-motion Tiananmen happening in Xinjiang with the ongoing mass internment and surveillance of Uyghurs and other Turkic Muslims. A better path forward was offered by Nobel Peace Prize laureate and Tiananmen student leader Liu Xiaobo, who co-authored Charter 08. Published on December 10, 2008, the 60th anniversary of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, it called for constitutional government and a respect for human rights. Despite official efforts to censor Charter 08, it was eventually signed by more than 10,000 people. Sadly, Liu Xiaobo spent a total of almost 16 years in prison and died in state custody in 2017. Today in China, the Tiananmen Square massacre is erased from history books, and any mention of it is censored. But we know the spirit of Tiananmen is still alive and well. We know because China's leaders demonstrate their fear of it every single day with their security cameras, censorship, detention centers, and obsession with preventing the people of China from learning the truth. We know the spirit of Tiananmen is alive and well in Hong Kong, where hundreds of thousands of people, as I mentioned earlier, have come together in Victoria Park to hold a candlelight vigil for the victims of the Tiananmen Square massacre. In his famous last statement, "I have no enemies," Liu Xiaobo said, and I quote, "No force can block the thirst for freedom that lies within human nature, and someday China, too, will be a nation of laws where human rights are paramount," end quote. I look forward to that day. And this afternoon, right after this hearing, the United States House of Representatives will consider a resolution to remember the victims of the violent suppression of the democracy protests in Tiananmen Square and throughout China. The resolution calls on the Chinese government to respect the universally recognized human rights of all people living in China and around the world. And I urge all my colleagues in the House to support this resolution. I now yield to the distinguished chair of the House Foreign Affairs Committee, Eliot Engel.
Well, thank you, Mr. Chairman. Senator Rubio, welcome to the House Foreign Affairs Committee. It's good to see so many people here. The place is packed because obviously this is a very important anniversary. Today marks the 30th anniversary of the Chinese government's violent crackdown against peaceful pro-democracy demonstrators in Tiananmen Square. I remember it well. It was my first year in Congress. On that dark day, the People's Liberation Army openly fired upon protesters, many of whom were students. We don't know how many lost their lives that day, but we do know that this tragedy derailed the hopes that China's economic reforms of the 1980s would be accomplished by political openness. The events at Tiananmen Square were a watershed moment for China, for the students, activists, and dissidents who hope for a brighter future for their country and, frankly, for the rest of the world. That day made clear that China's Communist Party intended to hang on to power at any cost and to suppress dissent violently if necessary. In the 30 years that followed, Chinese authorities have tried to erase from history the demonstration in Tiananmen Square and the subsequent bloodshed. You won't find any record of these events on China's internet or in the pages of the Chinese textbooks. And when the Chinese Communist Party is pushed for answers about the carnage at Tiananmen, officials justify the actions as a necessary cost for maintaining stability and delivering economic growth. We heard this refrain at the Shangri-La dialogue in Singapore just a few days ago. Since Tiananmen, the Chinese Communist Party has become even more authoritarian, a trend that has accelerated further under President Xi Jinping's rule. Lawyers, civil society leaders, and other champions of human rights, religious freedom, ethnic minority rights, and rule of law have been jailed, disappeared, or brutally repressed. More than 1 million Uyghurs and Muslim minorities in Xinjiang have been detained in re-education camps, which the Assistant Secretary of Defense for Asia has called a concentration camp, in an effort by the Chinese government to erase Uyghur culture and Islamic faith. Tibetans live under intense repression and surveillance, and the Chinese Communist Party continues to violate international religious freedom by insisting that the party has a role in approving the Dalai Lama's successor. Human rights and freedoms are also under siege in Hong Kong, which has traditionally maintained some autonomy under the promise of one country, two systems. China has started using immigration policy and its courts as a weapon against Western targets. It's increasing the use of exit bans as a tool of coercion and using politically motivated charges against people like Canadian citizen Michael Korvig to achieve diplomatic ends. More and more, the Chinese Communist Party exports its repressive values, whether by spreading surveillance technologies or trying to silence international criticism of its actions through economic coercion or reshaping international institutions to better reflect Beijing's views on issues like Taiwan. But that's not all. We also see China's attempts to rewrite history in other areas, such as its unfounded, illegal territorial claims in the South China Sea and its peddling of a false narrative of the Chinese occupation of Tibet. We cannot stand silent in the face of this aggression and abuse of so many people's basic rights and dignity. We must relentlessly put a spotlight on human rights violations, both those in the past and those today, and hold the perpetrators accountable. Today's hearing is a crucial reminder that China is not a unitary state or actor. Our concern should focus on the Chinese government and the Chinese Communist Party, not the Chinese people or Chinese civilization. That's why we condemn the Chinese government's cruel actions on June 4th, 1989. We urge the Communist Party to make a full and public accounting of those killed or missing. We urge the Chinese government to respect human rights and freedoms, to release arbitrary detainees, to overturn counterproductive policies on terrorism, speech, and cyber policy. We're also reminded today that there are Chinese women and men who, like the late Bo Xiaobo, and his wife, Liu Xia, continue to speak out against the Chinese government's oppressive policies and urge for reform and respect for universal human rights. These brave men and women know full well they're putting their lives on the line by speaking out this way, but they do so anyway because they refuse to give up on the vision of a brighter future for themselves and their country. So, in conclusion, we celebrate them. We share a common cause, which those who have advocated for and continue to advocate for a freer and more just Chinese society. We hope that their courage and persistence are not in vain. Thank you again, Mr. Chairman, and I yield back.
Thank you very much. And now I'm delighted to yield to a great champion of human rights, the gentleman from New Jersey, Mr. Smith.
Thank you very, very much, Mr. Chairman. Thank you and Senator Rubio for calling this hearing. This joint hearing of the Congressional-Executive Commission on China, of which I serve as ranking member, and the Lantos Human Rights Commission, of which I serve as co-chair, with our very, very eloquent lead witness, Speaker Pelosi, and I thank her for her leadership, and the heroes who will soon be testifying, underscores the importance that we attach, the profound importance, of remembering the infamous Tiananmen Square massacre, the day and days when the best, the bravest, and the brightest of China were brutally suppressed by dictatorship. 30 years ago, the world watched as over 1 million Chinese gathered to peacefully demand political reform and fundamental human rights. The hopes and promises of those heady days in 1989 brutally ended with the violence, tears, bloodshed, and detention and exile. But over the past 30 years, those tears have led to a renewed hope and a dream that someday China will be free and fundamental, universally recognized human rights would be respected. Mothers lost sons, fathers lost daughters, and China lost an idealistic generation on June 4th as the tanks rolled into Tiananmen Square. We also remember the massacre here in Congress each year because of its enduring impact on U.S. China relations. How do you deal with a country and treat with respect a dictatorship that so brutally disrespects its own people and, again, treats them with torture and other hideous and barbaric behavior? We remember it because an unknown number of people died, were arrested, and exiled for simply seeking human rights. We remember this date each year because it's too important to forget and because it's too dangerous in China to commemorate it. The legacy of Tiananmen Square was further seared in my memory when, after I, along with Frank Wolf, visited Beijing Prison Number 1 back in 1991. I will never forget the faces of those gaunt Tiananmen Square prisoners, and there were about 40 of them at that prison camp, their heads shaved in tattered clothes, bent over machines working grueling hours on clothing for the United States and other markets. I'll never forget that day. It inspired my efforts, along with many others, including Frank Wolf and Speaker Pelosi, to fight against the fantasy that trade and investment would somehow lead to political liberalization and human rights. Dictatorships do not matriculate to democracies because you give them more money. Matter of fact, I believe it makes them worse. As documented so well by the CECE's annual report, the domestic screws on dissent have tightened considerably since Xi Jinping assumed the presidency. The scope of Mr. Xi's repression is immense, with more arbitrary detentions, censorship, torture, and social control, as Senator Rubio pointed out a moment ago, like we've never seen. The surveillance state and the police state joined as one. President Xi and top Communist Party leaders regularly unleash bellicose attacks on universal values, Western ideals, and revisionism. They have further pushed through new laws that legitimize political, religious, and ethnic repression, further curtail civil liberties and civil society, and expand censorship on the internet. Rights lawyers and labor organizers are tortured and jailed. Hong Kong booksellers and Chinese activists disappear, even from safe havens like Thailand. Citizen journalists and religious leaders are arbitrarily detained. We have a new thing under Xi Jinping, Sinitization. The whole idea that every single religious body, from the Falun Gong to Christians to the Uyghurs to the Tibetan Buddhists, all have to comport with Xi Jinping's master plan of socialism. Impunity and repression and brutality are the ties that bind the Tiananmen Square massacre and the internment of over 1 million Uyghurs and other Turkic Muslims, what only can be described as concentration camps. The U.S. cannot be neutral when human rights are trampled with impunity or when crimes against humanity are being committed as we speak. Either you stand with Tank Man or you stand with the tank. There is no middle ground. That is why the CECE has pressed the administration, both past and present, to hold accountable those Chinese officials and businesses complicit in the most egregious human rights violations. Strong rhetoric condemning crimes against humanity occurring in Xinjiang are not enough at this point. Those who abuse universal freedoms with impunity should not prosper from access to the U.S. and other countries' political freedoms. It is the least that the U.S. can do to show leadership in a world where Chinese cash increasingly buys silence. We can no longer afford to separate human rights from our other interests. We know that presidents past have done that. That Tiananmen Square, we thought, would be the end of most favored nation status. And I joined Speaker Pelosi and David Bonnier and others in a bipartisan effort to say MFN ought to be linked with human rights. The president linked them. Unfortunately, then he delink them in 1994, and that led to, I think, an appraisal of the United States that profits trump human rights. Human rights matter. So does the rule of law. While the hopes of Tiananmen Square demonstrators have not yet been realized, the demands for universal freedoms continue to inspire the Chinese people today. I believe that someday China will be free. Someday the people of China will enjoy all of their God-given, universally recognized human rights. And a nation of free Chinese men and women will honor and celebrate the heroes of Tiananmen Square and all those who have sacrificed so much for so long for freedom. I yield back.
Well, thank you very much. And I know there are a lot of other people on the panel who want to speak, and I'm going to urge them to work their remarks into their questions. And we want to get to the panelists. And let me just say at the outset here that we have nothing but the highest regard for the people of China. We admire the culture, we admire the history and the traditions of China. We are here today because we're outraged about the human rights abuses that continue to occur, and we believe that for our friendship to grow, we need to see some change in terms of the government's human rights behavior. So I'm pleased to welcome an outstanding panel of witnesses who will examine how the Tiananmen Square massacre shaped new forms of repression in China and how demands of democracy have persisted in spite of that repression. They will also offer forward-looking recommendations on how U.S. policy can effectively support human rights and the rule of law in China. And that panel includes Wu Kexi, a leader in the 1989 Tiananmen protests and one of the Chinese government's most wanted student leaders. He's the chairman of the Taiwan Association for Democracy Advancement in China, and as a Uyghur national, he is a vocal critic of the Chinese government's human rights abuses in Xinjiang. He traveled all the way from Taiwan to join us this morning. We're grateful that you're here. We're also happy to welcome Feng, a 1989 Tiananmen student leader and co-founder and president of Humanitarian China. He has set up the first student broadcast center in Tiananmen Square and has become that has become the operations center for the protesters. He was also one of the most wanted student leaders. Mi Ling Shui, Communications Director at Human Rights in China, and lead of the Unforgotten Project, a series of profiles that tell the stories of victims and their families, including the Tiananmen Mothers Group. Karl Minzner, a professor of law at Fordham University. He's an expert in Chinese law and governance and author of End of an Era, How China's Authoritarian Revival is Undermining Its Rise. Professor Minzner also serves as senior counsel on the China Commission staff, and we are thrilled to welcome him back to Congress. And finally, Shanti Kalathil, did I pronounce that properly? Good, thank you. Director of the International Forum for Democratic Studies at the National Endowment for Democracy. She's a leading voice in Washington, D.C. on the Internet and authoritarian regime. She has authored several seminal reports on the Chinese government and Communist Party censorship, influence, operations, and development of sharp power. I want to thank you all for being here, and we look forward to hearing your testimony and recommendations. And Wu Kexi, we will begin with you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman, ladies and gentlemen of the committee, senators and members of the Congress, and through you, the freedom-loving people of this United States of America. See some old faces here, Mr. Smith. It's good to see you here always. It's a great honor to return to what I call the Chapel of Democracy on Capitol Hill, at the invitation of the Congressional-Executive Commission on China and the Tom Lantos Human Rights Commission. It was the Honorable Mr. Lantos himself, may he rest in peace, who invited me here 3 decades ago, after the torch of democracy we lit in Tiananmen Square was brutally extinguished, and I began my life of exile. Wu Kexi is here to remind us the struggle for democracy in China is not over, is how Mr. Lantos introduced me at that hearing. Those words still ring true, perhaps truer now than ever before. I said then that the Chinese Communist Party could not be trusted and was an existential threat to freedom and democracy around the world. It gives me no pleasure to say now that I told you so. I was called a lover of democracy at the Congressional Human Rights Foundation hearing through many people have asked, but though many people have asked me since, what do you know about democracy? It is true that when we student leaders led the mass democracy movement in Beijing, our knowledge and understanding of democracy was often limited to its face value and textbook doctrine, because we were from a communist totalitarian regime. But that is precisely why I am a lover of democracy and long for it, because I know what it's like not to have democracy and freedom. It is the most precious of gifts, and we must never take it for granted. That is why I have returned to this chapter of democracy to warn you once again that democracy is under attack. As the standard bearer and the defender of democracy, it is your solemn duty to protect it. I also have to tell you that the light of democracy in China was snuffed out because we were betrayed. You betrayed us. It was 30 years ago that we took the streets of Beijing and earned the world's sympathy and respect for attempting to plant the seeds of freedom and democracy in Tiananmen Square in China. We humbly asked China's leaderships to fulfill their promises to the people because in those heady days, everything seemed possible. Democracy was flowering in Poland, and the new thinking of Mikhail Gorbachev was creating excitement in the Soviet Union. In China, it was the beginning of opening up and reform, and the people were anxiously waiting for it to expand into the political domain, as we were promised. Those days, as a 21-year-old student leader marching on the street of Beijing and occupying Tiananmen Square, we not only had the support of the Chinese people, we had the support from all over the world, particularly in the democratic countries. Clearly, you felt we were fighting for the same as you had fought for and lived by. It felt like history was on our side and victory would be ours soon. But history records that this wasn't the past for China at that time. On June 4th, 1989, the Chinese Communist Party sent in tanks and troops to massacre the people it claimed to represent. In order to save its own skin, the Communist Party brutally suppressed freedom of expression and crushed all dissent. It has continued to rule since then at the barrel of guns, using fear and lies. After massacre and condemnation, the world's leaders parade back to Beijing so they could access China's market and its billion customers. They argued that change would come later. Trade delegation occasionally raised the issue of blatant human rights abuses because of the pressure back home from the distinguished members of the parliament or media or academia. But rarely did they wait for an answer or hold principles to be more important than money. The support we had didn't last, and we, the Chinese democracy activists, were abandoned to our fate. Mentioning Tiananmen became an inconvenience for the leaders of the world democracies. We were betrayed. Naturally, today's world leaders are not responsible for the mistake of their predecessor, but if you ignore the lessons of the past and continue to look the other way rather than hold the Communist Party accountable for its crimes, it will be too late to say or to do anything about it. And this looks suspiciously like a policy of appeasement. This policy started in early 1970s with Dr. Henry Kissinger, the chief architect of this China policy, insisting that it was in the national interest for the United States to form a united front against the #1 enemy of the country at that time, the Soviet Union. Certainly, there was no moral foundation for being so accommodating to the totalitarian Chinese regime. But when the Chinese regime massacred its own peaceful protesting people, will this policy be altered? No, it wouldn't. Not only did it take 4 days for the late President George H.W. Bush to condemn the atrocity, he secretly went to Beijing not long after. Why the secrecy? Later that very same year, the Berlin Wall fell, and then soon after, the Soviet Union collapsed. The Cold War, lasting 4 decades, has ended. The national interest that Dr. Kissinger proudly proclaimed that he was looking after has gone expired. Yet the policy remained, and Dr. Kissinger was received as one of Beijing's greatest friends, become fabulously rich by brokering favored access to the Chinese market for American companies. I have waited a long time for the United States to realize there is something fundamentally wrong with this picture. Perhaps it is only now that the businessman president finally sees it. I have been lucky enough to live in some of the freest places on earth, and I have had 30 years to absorb the idea of democracy. In that time, I have been labeled as a democracy activist, and it is a badge I wear with immense pride. In my experience, democracy is not a religion or set of standards, it's a practice, a dynamic process, constantly refined and improved. It is not perfect, but it always aims for perfection. It makes mistakes, but through voting allows choices and changes and the opportunity to put right the mistake of the past. Democracy cautiously trusts the people, and the will of the people is expressed through the democratic process. This is a very powerful and virtuous idea. As I have made plain today, I feel the democracy movement in China and democracy itself was betrayed by you, but I know you will appreciate this argument is, in fact, based on my strong faith in the righteousness of American democracy, I firmly believe you will, in the end, correct the mistake of the past to create a better future. My definition of democracy is not trusting and constantly exercising democracy until we arrive at the right judgment and choice. This is what I want for the people of China. I still mourn the loss of friends, fellow activists, and family. As a survivor, I keenly feel the guilt and the pain that belongs to the captain who didn't go down with his ship. Though it was a great thing that we tried to do, I sometimes wonder whether I would do it all over again. The cost was too great, measuring in the blood spilled by my fellow countrymen. We made the ultimate sacrifice. We inspired the world in winning one of the most challenging battles of the 20th century, the Cold War. Yet, in China, we are still waiting for that victory to come. I don't want to return to this chapter of democracy in the future and say, I told you so. Or once again remind you of the lesson of the past. With our shared conviction in the power of democracy, I hope that we can at last write a fitting conclusion to the story that starts 30 years ago with the Tiananmen Square protests. China deserves democracy too. I would like to echo Mr. Smith's very extinguished statement. You either stand with the tank man or you stand with the tank. I truly want to believe the world leaders, including those here today, are wise enough not to repeat the mistake of yesterday. I trust you have the courage to face up to China before it is too strong and it is too late. And this would belatedly make our sacrifice worthwhile. Thank you very much, ladies and gentlemen.
Thank you very much. Mr. Zhou Feng.
Thank you for inviting me.
I think make sure your microphone's on.
Thank you for inviting me to speak today. It's such an honor. 30 years ago, I was among the last to leave Tiananmen Square We were driven by tanks and machine guns. The tank was within 10 feet of me. Looking back at the Tiananmen Square, it was like a war zone. I vote to come back. 5 years ago, after testifying here at this exactly committee, I went back to Tiananmen. I was arrested and sent back. But even the police who arrested me told me that it was most hopeful and peaceful period in China's history. 30 years ago, I saw 40 bodies of young students just like me lying on the ground of a bicycle shed outside of Fuxing Hospital. Among them was Zhongqing. I vote to remember his name and speak for him as long as I live. At this very moment, my heart is with these suffering families, with the citizens of Beijing who risk everything to defend us against the tanks and marching troops and the storm of bullets. They saved us. My thoughts and prayers are with these people who last 30 years never stopped to fight for justice and truth. At this moment, I'm thinking of Pastor Wang Yi. We were praying together 12 years ago. I still remember his fervent and determined voice. He is now in prison, and so is his wife. We must demand his release immediately. For last 30 years, people like Liu Xiaobo, who have fought to the last breath of their life. 30 years ago, Liu Xiaobo was a visiting scholar at Columbia University before he flew back to China to lay down his life for this country. And he died in prison. He was the second to die in prison while being a Nobel Peace Laureate. The first one was in Hitler's Nazi Germany. We must remember him. The Chinese government wanted the world to forget him. Not even his ash were able to be found today. But when we made a bust sculpture for Liu Xiaobo and proposed it to Columbia University, the university where he stayed 30 years ago, they rejected. I asked this committee to offer a place here on Capitol Hill for Liu Xiaobo. This would surely demonstrate the commitment to democratization of China, and it will warm the hearts of all the Tiananmen generation. On the policy front, I ask this committee to work on Magnitsky Act. It could be a powerful tool against perpetrators of Tiananmen Massacre and human rights violations. Among the list we submitted to the State Department, one's name stands out. It's Li Xiaolin, the daughter of Li Peng, butcher of Beijing. After the massacre, his family were rewarded with ill-gotten wealth for the blood on their hands, banning Li Xiaolin and her family from entering and freezing their family assets in the United States will be a small and sure step towards justice against those who were responsible for the Tiananmen Massacre. It was a great mistake for the United States to allow China to enter WTO with the firewall. The firewall is a slavery in digital times. Every trade with the firewall in place strengthens the totalitarian regime. The firewall must be removed. China must open its internet before any trade talks. For all these years, we tried really hard to reach to the Chinese students here on the United States campus. I always receive strong and positive response from them as soon as I had opportunities to talk to them. But we are pretty much banned from the colleges in the United States simply because the strong presence of organized umbrella groups like CSSAs, which reports to the Chinese consulate embassy here. We must have a law to deal with this directly against the organized activities of Chinese Communist government in the United States. For 30 years, the appeasement policy has produced a monster. I'm delighted to say that the United States is awakening now. We must confront this evil empire at all fronts. I'm glad I'm here with friends today in this fight, and we will win. Thank you.
Thank you. Mi-Ling Sui, welcome.
Chairman McGovern, Co-Chairman Rubio, and Co-Chairman Smith, and members of Congress and staff, thank you for this opportunity to testify at this important and timely hearing. On the 30th anniversary of the June 4th massacre of unarmed civilians in Tiananmen Square and many different locations in Beijing, we are honored to be among this distinguished panel and to be able to give voice to the extraordinary efforts of the Tiananmen Mothers, a group of family members of June 4th victims, as well as survivors. For 3 decades, they have fought against state-enforced amnesia to engage in systematic efforts to gather evidence for an inevitable accounting of the killing, defying harassment, surveillance, and threats of retaliation. They have collectively identified and documented 202 individuals killed, and through exhaustive interviews with the families and eyewitnesses where possible, accumulated a large body of facts of the crimes committed against the victims. Since 1999, HRIC has worked to support the Tiananmen Mothers' demand for justice by disseminating their annual open letters and information they have accumulated to the international community. This year, for this 30th anniversary of June 4th, in addition to publishing the essay, which I attached to my testimony and request permission to be entered into the record, we have focused our advocacy contribution on our Unforgotten project. The project draws on the extensive documentation compiled by the Tiananmen Mothers, including interviews, essays, videos, and photographs, to tell the individual stories of some of the victims, about how they lived and how they died, and how their deaths have affected their families. The project seeks to highlight the enormous human cost, that resulted from Chinese government brutality and the group's refusal to accept enforced amnesia about a tragic episode not only for the Chinese people, but also for all of humanity. They have accomplished this work by force of their moral outrage, mutual support, and tenacity in their pursuit of justice for their loved ones. The group began with Ding Ziling, the mother of Jiang Jielian, a 17-year-old high school student who was shot dead on the evening of June 3rd. She reached out to Zhang Xianling, another mother whose 19-year-old son, Wang Nan, was killed in the early morning of June 4th. Several months later, a note was left at the grave of Wang Nan by a third woman, You Weijie, who lost her husband, Yang Minghu, in the massacre. But identifying the dead has not been easy. Often names of the dead were whispered to the early members of the group or delivered on slips of paper. Sometimes the people who provided information did not even dare to identify themselves. And there were times when families of victims simply refused to be found, perhaps out of a sense of shame. While some families live in Beijing, many others are far from the capital, some in the remote farming hinterland where roads don't reach. Some parents could not read or write, scratching out a living from farming. A heartbreaking fact quickly emerged. A victim from a poor family was almost always the most promising among the children, the only child that the family could afford to send to university in Beijing, whose death dashed the prospect of a better economic future for the family. It is from this material that the world can know about how the victims were killed. They were killed by martial law troops firing indiscriminately into crowds. They were shot in the back by troops who chased them into alleys. They were stabbed with bayonets after being shot. They were crushed by tanks while waiting to cross the street. They were crushed by tanks coming from behind them after they had left Tiananmen Square. They were run over by military trucks while standing at the roadside, waiting to cross the street. While many died instantly, others who made it to the hospital still breathing were met by doctors ordered to treat soldiers only. Family members who went to hospitals to claim the bodies of their loved ones were told to hurry before the troops came to remove evidence. And bodies were hidden by soldiers in a shallow grave in the front lawn of a high school. Since 1995, the Tiananmen mothers have appealed to Chinese leaders for open dialogue with them as a group to respond to the three basic demands: the truth of what happened, accountability for the killing, and compensation to survivors and families of victims. Never once has the Chinese government responded to the request. A few days ago, we received a message from a group member who managed to see our project website, which gave her a sense of how the people outside China remember June 4th. She said, quote, "Seeing the stories about the victims and families made me feel so bad because I imagine that in the outside world, there must be all sorts of commemorative activities marking the 30th anniversary of June 4th. But inside China, it is like a stagnant pool. We are being monitored." How is it that the Chinese government has been able to get away with murder? Not without the complicity of the international community. Too many foreign governments accepted the bargain post-Tiananmen to look the other way, to accept what is unacceptable in a civilized world, in exchange for entry into China's vast consumer and labor markets. And governments and foreign companies conveniently believe that China's increased integration into the international community would help it democratize and play by international rules. But as we have seen and continue to see, the opposite is true. Impunity for June 4th has emboldened the Chinese leaders to perpetuate and refine the crackdown model, to use it to obliterate diverse voices that the government does not want to hear. Against this dark reality, the courage demonstrated by the Tiananmen mothers acts as a guiding force for the international community and for all of us to do more to stand up to the authoritarian regime and demand justice. On this anniversary, we are encouraged by the introduction of House Resolution 393 by Chairman McGovern and by the solidarity message sent by this hearing that the U.S. government will not allow enforced amnesia to silence the truth, and that you stand with the Tiananmen mothers and their struggle to press for truth, accountability, and compensation. The message that the member of the Tiananmen mothers sent to us several days ago ended with this note that highlights a force that we should not overlook. She said, "I heard that more than 100 people are being forced to leave Beijing. You can see from this how the government is afraid of the power among civil society to lift the lid on the case of the June 4th massacre. The international community has an important role to play in supporting Chinese civil society actors under assault. One immediate action that everyone can take is to leave a message for the Tiananmen mothers in the What You Can Do section of our Unforgotten Project site, which we will translate and channel to the Tiananmen mothers. To those trapped inside the prison of authoritarian China, every single message from the outside, either to them as a group, to individual members, or about individual victims, will be a source of strength. I'd just like to end with this note. On October 10, 2010, Liu Xia, wife of Liu Xiaobo, visited him in prison and delivered the news that he was awarded the Nobel Peace Prize. She later told the press, he cried and said that this Nobel Peace Prize belonged to all the lost souls of June 4th. Thank you.
Thank you. Mr. Minsner.
Thank you so much, Chairman, members of Congress, and staffers for organizing this important hearing. It's an honor to be here and with such distinguished panelists. In the late 1970s and 1980s, Chinese leaders such as Deng Xiaoping steered China out of the stagnation, isolation, and chaos of the Maoist era and into the reform era. Ideologically and economically, China opened up. The ideological fervor of the Maoist era faded. Newly pragmatic party policies gave officials and citizens latitude to import concepts and practices from abroad. Authorities backed out of people's daily lives. Religion came back. Churches, mosques, and temples reopened, at least under state control. And market reforms gave citizens control over their croplands and their careers, helping fuel a decades-long boom. Politically, China stabilized. The 1980s saw Chinese leaders support the emergence of a range of partially institutionalized political norms to address the chaos and instability that they themselves had personally experienced under Mao. These included collective leadership rather than Maoist single-man rule, development of internal norms regarding the regular promotion, retirement, and succession of top leaders, partial depoliticization of the bureaucracy, with party authorities turning responsibility for managing day-to-day affairs of state over to technocrats within the bureaucracy, and emergence of bottom-up input institutions, such as village elections, giving citizens a limited degree of voice into the political process and contributing to state legitimacy. Then came 1989. Chinese leaders were put to the test. Do you allow the forces that you yourself unleashed begin to fundamentally reshape your political system, or do you revert to Leninist one-party controls? Beijing chose the latter. On the streets, repression, and so too within the party. Reformers were cashiered, ideological controls reasserted, and the principle that one-party rule should never, ever be called into question was reaffirmed loud and clear in internal political study sessions. China's reform era did not end in 1989. In the 1990s and early 2000s, economic reform and social change continued to produce a host of private actors, commercial media, and internet outlets airing citizen grievances that Beijing struggled to control. and many within the party's own bureaucracy continued to experiment with limited governance reforms, such as administrative law reforms aimed at addressing corruption and abuse of power within local government. Back in the early 2000s, one could imagine a world in which, even if real democratic reform was totally off the table, such innovations might allow the hard edges of China's political system to be slowly sanded smooth. That did not happen. As each of those reforms was instituted, citizens rushed to use them, first to criticize local officials, then to make deeper political claims. And at each point, whether with village elections in the late 1990s, legal reforms around 2003, or a flourishing online discussion around 2010, party leaders saw shades of Tiananmen Square. They saw shades of 1989 and moved to pull the rug out from under their own reforms or to reassert their grip over fields, such as the internet, where they felt their controls had slipped. In Beijing, party officials like to think of their response to 1989 and subsequent years as a successful antidote. In fact, the Global Times op-ed from yesterday, I think, compared it to a vaccine, saving China from the fate of the Soviet Union. But in reality, it has been a destructive virus. Beijing's reflective desire to reassert party controls has mutated and is spreading through the veins of China's political system, undermining and destroying much of the potential that had been introduced in the early reform era. Economically, Beijing's push for control has led it to turn away from the market-oriented policies of the reform era. Since the early 2000s, there's been a recommitment to industrial policy, a resurgence of state-owned enterprises and designated national champions, and the resulting policies, such as a massive increase in bank lending going to state-owned enterprises, are slowly asphyxiating China's private sector. Ideologically, what limited space had opened up during China's reform era is steadily contracting. In field after field, whether media, law, higher education, or civil society, controls have been ramped up to the tightest in decades. Draconian new controls have descended upon religious belief, particularly those viewed as foreign, and particularly in China's western region of Xinjiang, where some 10% of the Muslim Uyghur population has been thrown since 2017 into an extensive network of political re-education camps aimed at forcibly remolding their ethnic and religious identity. And politically, those reform-era norms that the party itself adopted have steadily been broken one by one. Since Xi Jinping's accession to power in 2012, power has reconcentrated in the hands of a single leader. Elite retirement and succession norms have been toppled. China is now swinging back towards single-man authoritarian rule, potentially for decades to come. Technocrats are being sidelined by party cadres, and what space had once existed in China's halls of power for honest discussion among officials themselves over the very real challenges facing China, such as how to address mounting debt, trade conflicts, and rising social tensions, is being choked off as the fear of falling on the wrong side of a rapidly changing political line is leading a stifling blanket of silence and inertia to descend over the bureaucracy. Naturally, all of this poses deep risks for China. Chinese leaders themselves launched China into the reform era as a response to the political turmoil of the Cultural Revolution and the excesses of the Maoist era. But today, you can see many of those practices begin to push themselves zombie-like back to the surface again as the reform era steadily unwinds. And that is yet another tragedy of Tiananmen. Not only did an untold number, hundreds or thousands, die in the evening of June 3rd or 4th and the days to follow, and not only did 1989 close the door on a route for China's political system to gradually evolve into something better, but Beijing's decision in 1989 continues to reverberate and amplify today, and it is steadily dragging the country backwards out of the reform era and increasing the risk that China will experience a reoccurrence of yet more tragic periods in its own history. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Ms. Colathil, welcome.
Thank you. I would like to thank the Congressional-Executive Commission on China, the Tom Lantos Human Rights Commission, and the House Foreign Affairs Committee for the opportunity and privilege of presenting testimony here today alongside such distinguished colleagues. On this day, we grapple with the events of Tiananmen, both the hope and the bloodshed, and their legacy 30 years later. Part of that legacy is an unsettling disconnect. Even as people have grown more connected and our collective access to information has expanded exponentially, there has been a curious muffling surrounding the world's remembrance of June 4th. Over the years, as vigils diminished and stories grew more hushed, a Tiananmen Square-sized gap emerged not only inside China, but outside as well. The excising of Tiananmen, not merely from Chinese history, but from the world's collective memory, is in fact no accident. Through censorship and self-censorship and augmented by technology, Tiananmen, along with the broad swath of topics deemed sensitive, has disappeared down what the scholar Glenn Tiffert calls the Chinese Communist Party's memory hole, with pernicious effects on current events reporting, self-expression, even in the entire historical record. This memory hole constitutes just one aspect of a vast apparatus designed to mold the broader information ecosystem around the world in ways that help solidify the CCP's role at home, as well as reshape the global order to favor this outcome. While it does not always function flawlessly, even within China's borders, this complex machinery is nonetheless likely to reinforce authoritarian norms and institutions and undercut democratic ones on a global basis. The Chinese Party state is keenly aware of the transformative role of information and has always tried to harness it. Over the years, the term informatization gradually became synonymous with a complete rethinking of how information technology would both suffuse and power economic, political, and social development. This indicates a party state that, rather than simply fearing information, fears even more the implications of not mastering it. With the advent of new tools, informatization has proved crucial in the implementation of China's modern surveillance state, including but not limited to the development of public security intelligence that has contributed to the Uyghur human rights crisis. With the introduction of artificial intelligence, informatization has been joined by the newer intelligentization, with its corresponding augmentations and implications. Even when the CCP projects capabilities that might not actually exist yet, this represents the logical development of long-standing CCP thinking on information, surveillance, and social control. As AI evolves and becomes seamlessly integrated into the normal functioning of society, it will become increasingly invisible and potentially open to abuse. Crucial questions about democratic rights and standards are correctly being asked and debated in democracies by policymakers, companies, developers, scholars, and activists. China's authoritarian system, however, restricts what type of questions are allowed to be asked about technology, who gets to ask those questions, and ultimately, who decides. For technologies designed to both disappear into and yet dictate the rhythms of everyday life, the effect may be to imperceptibly manipulate debate and shape individual behaviors in an increasingly targeted way, buttressed by millions of data points enabling previously unimagined specificity. More than that, it will present those affected with an imperceptible fait accompli that subjects them to the standards of the CCP information ecosystem. This is not some far-off future, but a phenomenon unfolding in real time, including with the platforms that are widespread within China and now around the world. WeChat, for instance, has become indispensable for Chinese citizens, providing the allure and convenience of deftly integrated communication, services, and amenities, even as this convenience is backed by an equally seamless surveillance and censorship apparatus. With these platforms increasingly being used all over the world, it is imperative that users examine them not solely through the lens of consumer benefits, business models, or economic competition, but through the prism of implications for rights and governance. At the level of ideas and norms, the Chinese Party state is using rhetoric that mimics yet undermines the liberal order, injecting its own vision into the existing global framework of norms, institutions, policy models, and standards governing the Internet and information technologies. According to 2017's International Strategy for Cooperation in Cyberspace, the Chinese government, quote, fully respects citizens' rights and fundamental freedoms in cyberspace and safeguards their rights to be informed, to participate, to express, and to supervise while protecting individual privacy in cyberspace. To be clear, there is no private realm within China into which the CCP cannot intrude. This long-standing practice of definitional and substantive warping has manifested itself in numerous related areas as well, including those pertaining to human rights and development. As Samantha Hoffman points out, the ability to shape and repurpose long-standing norms is a fundamental part of the CCP's conception of discourse power, underpinning Internet governance, big data, AI, social credit systems, and even the often invisible standard-setting process for the next generation of technological infrastructure. It should be clear by now that the Chinese Party state's actions in the global information space are not limited to China exporting hardware and know-how to other ambitious authoritarian states. Beijing's actions have serious implications for all democracies and democratic actors, and for the web of democratic norms and institutions upon which they rest. Any response will need new policy language, frameworks, and cooperation between democracies. Civil society will have a key role to play. The leadership of institutions critical to the health of the public sphere, publishers, media and technology executives, university administrators, and so on, must reinvigorate their commitment to democratic standards and free expression through new or innovative mechanisms if necessary. Only through crystallizing understanding of these matters and galvanizing civil society's contribution can democracies address their vulnerabilities, shore up resilience, and reclaim their own discourse power. Thank you, and I look forward to taking your questions.
Thank you very much. Thank you all for your excellent testimonies. I'd now like to yield to Senator Rubio for comments or questions.
Thank you. I'll be brief in my questions in the interest of time. I just wanted to ask Mr. Zhou, in January, BuzzFeed reported that the online service LinkedIn blocked your profile in China and then later restored it due to negative publicity. Can you tell us what happened?
So earlier this year, one day I received an email in my mailbox telling me that I was censored due to their policy. And so I tweet about it on my Twitter. And then some reporters covered this and asked questions they asked LinkedIn about what happened. And quickly, they changed their policy. I don't really know what happened. When I ask, there's no answer. They blame technical error on this. But to me, I believe it was most likely because my continued posting about my activities as president of humanitarian China, especially when it relates to human rights and Tiananmen. So it was considered inconvenient for its Chinese market. That's why I was censored.
I guess my question is, LinkedIn is a biographical site. Did you use LinkedIn to speak out politically, or you used the other platforms to speak out politically, but they censored you because of who you were?
Yes, I use every platform I can find. And I realized before the censoring that I could reach my Chinese friends in China through LinkedIn. That's why I post about that. For me, that's my job. That's part of my profession now as a full-time human rights activist, to talk about what I do.
Did they ever tell you, LinkedIn ever tell you what exact policy it was that they had found you in violation of?
No, there's no specifics on this.
Mr. Kai-Chi, you're an ethnic Uyghur in background and one of the student leaders who initiated one of the largest protests in Chinese history. Could a Uyghur student have such a prominent position now?
Thank you, Senator. Well, I found 1989 from April, let's say 17th, that's the time I think I first time step up and start to give speeches until June 4th. There are about 50 days. Those 50 days that were the times that I have experienced in China being Uyghur without feeling being discriminated in Tiananmen Square by my fellow students. That's one of an extraordinary time. I was brought up in China. The discrimination is constant and it's everywhere. But only in the setting of we're fighting for a greater goal together in democracy and human rights in 1989, that discrimination in Tiananmen Square vanished. And today, let alone becoming a prominent political figure who has influence in China, nowadays, other than Communist Party, nobody can do it in any ethnic, even in the dominant Han Chinese are prohibited from becoming influential in China other than within the party. And for Uyghur people, that situation is much, much worse. You don't need to have an opinion to be persecuted. In early days, I often say, like, I am a dissident. I choose this path. Well, history kind of put me in this position, but I gladly accepted this path of being a being a Chinese dissident. So therefore, I understand the ramification. I understand there are some consequences following that. But for those who did not do anything, didn't challenge the government, simply because they are Uyghur and being prosecuted, being oppressed, that it's one of the most heart-aching truths that I have to live with today, including especially my ailing parents. They are not getting younger or healthier, and then they are, among the student leaders, I think, from back in Tiananmen, I think I am the only one person who haven't been able to see my parents in 30 years because Chinese government denied them from traveling abroad. I just appreciate this opportunity to elaborate a little bit on how we need to see, how we need to treat Chinese regime. They are barbaric. And they are, this action of denying my parents' rights to travel abroad is primitive. And these are the words that I can use because these are the words we were taught in China growing up. Like if somebody who are totally innocent of being punished because of a relative, a family member of a criminal, that will be considered as barbaric and primitive. But then that's the only word that I can use today to think about this regime. Thank you, sir.
Thank you very much. Mr. Swazi of New York.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thanks to all the chairmen and all my colleagues. It's a great honor for me to be on the dais with all of you with so much experience in this area. And I thank you to the witnesses. You were all very moving. You educated me quite a bit today. And Mr. Wurak Kaishi, I want to thank you. You said you felt betrayed by us, and I think that's understandable. And I can appreciate that, especially what's happening to the Uyghurs today after all this time. You know, the talk of today is about the Chinese are cheating when it comes to global trade. They're cheating about stealing intellectual property. They're cheating with not having access to their markets. They're cheating the way they subsidize the businesses. And that's all true. They are cheating. They're breaking the rules. But I don't think that the general public, certainly here in the United States of America, has a sense of what you're talking about today. They don't understand the human rights abuses that are so widespread throughout China. They don't know that many Chinese don't know about Tiananmen Square. That's hard to imagine. If you're living in the American culture, you know, the idea of seeing the man in front of the tank, that many of us have all seen that, at least if you're over 30 years old, 25 years old, you've seen that. But the idea that people in China don't know about that is hard to imagine. The idea that Uyghurs are living in concentration camps and people are being abused, and Mr. Smith and I have a bill that we're working on that we've presented that we hope will get support of the members of this committee, and we hope that you'll be interested in that as well. I don't think people realize that people who are doing a candlelight vigil today, right now as we speak, in Hong Kong, people are going to be detained, people are going to be arrested, and we need to monitor that very carefully, Mr. Chairman, as to what's happening to it in Hong Kong today with the people who are out there with the candlelight vigil. We need to monitor very closely what's happening with those folks. People don't understand about the journalists that have been detained. People don't understand how they're trying to change the Tibetan language, no longer be the language in Tibet again, and trying to make everyone speak the same way and do it prefecture by prefecture. So we have a lot of work to do. I want to ask you, Mr. Wirkoshi, do you try and tell us, and I know you don't have a statistical answer to this, but what percentage of Chinese people do you think understand what happened at Tiananmen Square? Is it half the people? Is it less than half?
Thank you, sir. If it please. Well, I think we need to remember the Chinese regime do their very best to censor internet, any kind of information flow into China.
Not in the textbooks or the schools,
of course.
Nowhere.
My name is, for instance, is definitely not sought, cannot be found in any of the search engine in China. And then actually it's also been banned from being used as to name a newborn among Uyghurs. So the thing that the world need to understand is Chinese regime used their utmost possible extreme.
No, I understand what they're doing. I want you to just give me, I know it's not going to be precise. Would you say half the people know about Tiananmen Square, or would you say less than half?
Less than that. I think probably 20, maybe percent.
Joe, would you agree with that?
Yeah, I think I would answer that. I think it's definitely less than half. Even for our generation who witnessed it or personally experienced it, most of us only saw a little part of it, never know the whole story like I do here. So, and also because the younger generation today grow up completely under the shadow of the firewall. That means every thinking.
I want to just try and get across the idea that people, that they're effective in doing this. I mean, Americans, I don't think, can understand this concept that only 20% of the Chinese people know about Tiananmen Square.
Right.
So we need to, I don't want to take up any more time because my colleagues want to ask questions as well. But I would like to offer of coming to New York, to my district. I have a lot of Chinese Americans in my district, to come and to talk about what we talked about today, to educate people as to what's going on with the Uyghurs, what's going on with Tibet, what's going on in Hong Kong, what happened at Tiananmen Square. We need to educate the American people because, as you said earlier, this is a dynamic process and it's constant work we have to do. And part of that work is educating the American people so that they can support you in this effort, because nobody likes the idea that they betrayed you, and we need to do work to try and address this. And I'm committed to working with you. I want you to come to my district if you're interested, and we'll try and get in the New York media market to try and educate people as to what's happening here. Because right now it's, you know, you talked about the Chapel of Democracy, and this rumor, not enough people know what's going on. So thank you so much for being here today.
Thank you, sir.
Thank you for the offer. I would definitely work with you on that. Thank you.
Mr. Smith.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. Thank you all to our witnesses. Your testimonies were extraordinary, very incisive. And, you know, to Mr. Wu Kai-shi, thank you for warning us once again, as you put it. I think you spoke with such candor that as a standard bearer and defender of democracy, it is your solemn duty to protect, talking to us. I also tell you that the light of democracy in China was snuffed out because you let us down. You betrayed us. There are many of us who feel that that is absolutely true. While we cannot dictate events in Washington, we were complicit, words used by other witnesses. I was one of those who thought that President Bush, the first Bush, got it wrong, particularly when he sent Brent Scowcroft to China to reassure them that no problems here. But I think that also became a bipartisan complicity that is under-recognized and underappreciated for the impact it had on the democracy movement. I've chaired 68 congressional hearings on human rights abuses in China over the years. Several of those had to do with the democracy activists. I had one in 1996, December 18th. Was there a Tiananmen Square massacre, the visit of General choix. As you all know, he was the operational commander who was sent into tanks. He also became the defense minister, and to his shame, Bill Clinton invited him to the White House, gave him a 19-gun salute, and then he went to the Army War College and said, nobody died at Tiananmen Square. Now, back home, it was all carried as if it were truth. Of course, it was disputed here. I put together a hearing 2 days later, had Tiananmen Square activists who were there and bore truth. We gave a chair and invited the embassy to come, the Chinese embassy. They failed to show, as did choix. But that kind of bold-faced lie in the face of something that was watched on CNN live was appalling. But that's the kind of disinformation and lying that they get away with. I also had hearings on the WTO, arguing with the Clinton administration again. How can you accept them into the WTO when they break with impunity human rights standards and norms, universally recognized human rights? So that hearing was in 1996 as well, and it was part of a series of hearings. They were accepted. Again, profits trumped human rights, and it has been a bipartisan, and I would respectfully say colossal failure. Hopefully we've learned from it. Hopefully this administration will turn that page, which previous ones have not done. I'd also say President Obama did the same thing. when he had Hu Jintao, the president, on the White House for a joint press conference. One of the reporters, AP, asked a very good question about human rights. All of a sudden, there were problems with hearing the question, and President Obama jumped in and gave a defense of this dictatorship. Yeah. So bad was it that the Washington Post did an editorial, Obama defends who on human rights. It was a great editorial underscoring that complicity that was talked about a moment ago. So let me just ask, lessons learned. Do you think we're finally at that point where we've learned them? Secondly, I did an op-ed in the Washington Post. I want to ask you to read it if you haven't seen it. You know it because you live it and you have friends who are living it. The world must take a stand against China's war on religion, the existential threat that is now posed by Xi Jinping to co-opt it. It was mentioned earlier by one of our witnesses. Carl, you talked about draconian controls. Please speak briefly to that, because the world does have to speak out against this. We have the International Religious Freedom Act filled with sanctions that need to be levied against China. We've got the Global Magnitsky Act. That needs to be used on different human rights abuses. Speak to those issues as well.
Thank you, Mr. Smith. And I think you would agree that we are friends. Like and then I would also like to echo my friend Zhou Fengsuo just said. We are among friends today. And then yes, I did say quite plainly that you betrayed us. But I also said within democracy we believe in. We have the conviction of democracy, which is a dynamic process that which we will learn from our mistake. One of the biggest mistake is that the United States, the government especially, the presidents in the past, the world leaders had to follow United States later, is to treat China as something it really isn't. The Chinese regime. I'm talking about the Chinese Communist Party regime. The world United States government treat Chinese regime as a big country, responsible stakeholders. Well, it's supposed to be, but in the matter of fact, we really should know what Chinese regime is. It's a group of bandits who stole the position of ruling one of the largest country and took advantage of that position to loot the country. You would much better off if you when forming your China policy to consult with your criminologist instead of international relation experts. To apply Magnitsky Human Rights Act into every individual, because you know if you read through the Magnitsky Act itself, and you will find it does apply to every member of this 200 families. If you, let me report to you, gentlemen here, if you want to come up with a China policy that works, I mean, in the last 30 years, haven't we all been a little frustrated with the China policy? That just doesn't seem to work. Then let me give you a tip. Start visa sanctions, start freezing the assets of the 200 elite families, so-called. I think within 2-3 weeks, they will send the delegations and come to the United States and talk about democracy, talk about the reform that we have long wanted. It is time to make condemnations. It is time to express concern. It is time to apply much harder, much stronger actions. We have long passed that. They have put more than 1 million Uyghurs in concentration camp, more than 1 million in the 21st century. The worst human rights abuses since Holocaust we're talking about. And then if we suggested Magnitsky Act to certain levels, and then what the response we get from this administration is, okay, yeah, we probably should do that, but not on the level too high. What is too high? What is the arbitrary level that human rights abuses accountability should be set on? That would be the question I would like to ask friends today. I do say that you betrayed me, but within democracy we can right the mistake in the past, and then I'm counting under this chapter of democracy from you, our friends of Chinese democracy activists. Thank you.
I'll just respond to the Chairman Smith's question on with respect to religion. I think you're dead on to be watching the religious issue. With the beginning of the Reform era, the party took a step back from people's personal lives, and underground churches, the revival after decades of Maoist suppression of religious belief, was one notable trend in the 80s, 90s, and early 2000s. As the impetus for control comes back, it's hit certain fields first, the more public-facing ones, law, media, things like that. But as it rolls on, it's going to get deeper into private areas, and religion is the key one. All religions are going to be affected, but some religions are going to be affected more than others precisely because they're regarded as foreign. What you're seeing in Xinjiang is sort of the leading edge. I think you obviously want to watch Christianity because that's large, it's organized, and I think the pressures are coming on. I think the sort of the roundups of key religious leaders in multiple different provinces just last fall, and I think you can sort of see the waves starting to increase. So I think it's exactly what to be watching.
I would like to add that human rights abuses are no longer contained within the borders of China. And as the Chinese government amasses enormous economic and political clout in the international community, it is aggressively trying to export its own models of development and human rights, the so-called human rights with Chinese characteristics. And they are trying to rewrite the principles of human rights internationally that are based on the lessons that the world learned from the horrors of the Second World War.
Okay, let me add some. I think since Tiananmen Massacre, the Communist government has declared war on Chinese people, and that is true today. And it was reiterated a few days ago by the defense minister, Feng, as his praise, the decision was decisive, correct. And such a regime that can invade its own capital with tanks and could kill without accountability, there's no limit to what they can do. I would also echo on the the export of threats to the outside of China's border. With the new technology, Communist China can do enormous damage, can bring disaster to human being without even going out of its own border. Be it AI, big data, and also we should notice the genetic engineering front. The first genetically engineered pregnancy, and there's also the report about putting human genes in monkey, for example. These just have disastrous consequence to everyone outside of China. So we must confront this.
Thank you. Mr. Sears.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, for holding this hearing and all the other chairmen that are here, and thank you for being here today. And really talk about to the degree that the Communist Party would go to stay in power. This is something that I hope the rest of the country is listening to what your statements have been. I am very concerned about what is happening in the Western Hemisphere. This China experiment now is making its way through the Western Hemisphere. I see it in Cuba. I see it now in Venezuela, where China is exporting facial recognition to the Maduro government so they can continue to control the populace as they demonstrate. I'm concerned, and maybe I would like you to say something about this. China goes around giving scholarships to journalists so they can go and study journalism in China. To me, that is the most ridiculous and ironic part of the Chinese Communist government. Yes. That you will have journalists to study journalism in a place where you cannot even make an expression of discontent, let alone speak and write about what is going on in that country. And they're doing that throughout the world, but especially in the Western Hemisphere. I see people from Argentina going, I see people from Chile going to study journalism. Can you talk a little bit about that? Someone? Anyone?
Mr. Sears, I'm a member of, I'm emeritus board member of Reporters Without Borders, also known as Reporters Sans Frontières, which is a RSF based in Paris, a pioneer organization in defending press freedom. And we have issued a report about creeping of the Chinese influence on this particular area. And then I thank you very much for bringing that up. Yes, China is inviting a lot of country, their closer friends, and then you look closer into it, and then you find few of them are democratic countries. They invite their citizens to go to Beijing to study journalism. Not only that, China are establishing journalism school in Africa. That's what was happening nowadays, and then I find it's a mockery on the face of the world. I mean, and then we, China, can now teach people about democracy and about journalism. Just not long time ago, when Xi Jinping visited CCTV, the China Central Television, they put on a screen behind them and say, CCTV's last name is Cc's Chinese Communist Party. Well, it's kind of lost in the translation right there, but it kind of also worked kind of neat too. I mean, it's both C, a communist party. And then when I was in Beijing, I was studying, my classmate who was in the journalism school told me the definition of journalism in their textbook is journalism in China means being the mouth and ears of the party. So yes, it's so they have no clue about what is journalism. They only understand one thing that's called propaganda. Or let me put it in an even more blunt way, they only believe in lie. So to the world seeing China exporting lies is, of course, is an existential threat to the universal value and then the practice of democracy we're living in. Thank you very much, sir.
Let me just add to that briefly. I think that in two areas, both the exporting of authoritarian technology in the Western Hemisphere, the Chinese party state has been particularly active. You may recall there was a recent New York Times story about a system called ECU 911 in Ecuador. That system is based on facial recognition that was deliberately delivered by the Chinese party state at the request of the Ecuadorians.
Ecuador, I apologize.
I'm sorry?
I meant to include Ecuador, I apologize.
But it is actually in several countries throughout the Western Hemisphere, some version of that. In Venezuela, the fatherland card is based on principles of social credit that, again, stem from the Chinese system. But I think it's in the journalism exchanges where you've rightly highlighted that there is a significant issue because frequently in these countries, these exchanges are not perceived to be different from the types of trainings that are provided by democratic actors. And it's partly because the Chinese party state has been so successful in engaging with the public space of these countries around the world, Western Hemisphere, Sub-Saharan Africa, Central Europe, and so on. They're showing up in ways that the democracies are not. And so in the absence of robust journalism training, for instance, or exchanges, or the types of engagement that democracies might be providing, the Chinese party state is there with tremendous resources. And so if they're offered, if these budding journalists in these countries throughout the Western Hemisphere are offered a chance to go to China for a week on an all-expenses-paid trip, they will likely jump at it because they see it as an opportunity that they wouldn't normally have. And they probably bring to that very little experience with the Chinese system, very little knowledge of the CCP. So that's also a failure on the part of the democracies to really be engaged in this space.
Anybody else? Anybody else? Thank you.
Thank you very much, and I apologize. I'm going to turn this over to Senator Rubio. I have to work this bill on that I mentioned earlier is coming up on the floor in about 10 minutes. But if I just want to close by thanking, close for my part, by thanking all of you for being here. You know, as I said in the beginning, China has given so much to the world over so many years. And, you know, when I visited China with Leader Pelosi a few years back, I mean, it was an incredible experience, the history, the culture, but most especially the people that we met. So if anyone asks, all of us up here are on the side of the Chinese people and our problems with the Chinese government and their fundamental lack of respect for basic human rights and human dignity. You know, human rights is supposed to be important because it is important, and not only here in the United States, but all around the world. And everybody on this planet deserves to have their fundamental human rights respected. And people here in the United States and around the world, I think, were especially horrified with what happened in Tiananmen Square is because we saw it. I mean, the pictures were there. I mean, we mentioned Tank Man, but the students and the average people that we saw and heard about, you know, moved us all. So none of us can erase that from our minds, and no matter how much the Chinese government wants to rewrite history and have history books that don't include this chapter, I mean, the chapter is included in every other history book in the world. It's etched in our minds, and we'll never forget it. You know, and one of the things I think the Chinese government hasn't counted on is that with the advent of technology, news is getting in and out of China. I mean, we are learning about what's happening to the Uyghurs. We are learning about what's happening to Tibetans because news is leaking out. And also, what we say here gets back to them. And so they can't control everything. When I was in Tibet with Leader Pelosi, the Chinese government tried to control every step of our visit. But every time we, you know, walk down a hallway, somebody would come out and just whisper to us, you know, please tell His Holiness the Dalai Lama that we love him and that we respect him. So no matter how much they try to erase history, it can't be done. And I think, you know, your testimony here today on this occasion is especially powerful because I think it's a signal to the Chinese government that we are not going to forget and that we need to think imaginatively and out of the box at new ways to let them know how much human rights matters to all of us. And so this is incredibly important, and I thank all of you for being here. This has been an excellent panel, and I'll now turn this over to Senator Rubio.
Thank you. Congressman Wagner.
Thank you. Thank you, Senator Rubio, and thank you to the Congressional-Executive Commission on China and to the Tom Lantos Human Rights Commission for organizing this important hearing today. I commend our panelists for their courage and thank them for being here today. Since 2011, China has spent more money on controlling its own population than on defending against foreign powers. According to some sources, China's annual spending on domestic stability maintenance, as they call it, its police state apparatus, frankly, now surpasses defense spending by nearly 17%. Mr. Zhou, does stability maintenance effectively dampen dissent, or has it sparked resentment against the state?
That's true on both fronts. It creates more enemies, more people who suffered from such measures of so-called stability maintenance. But on the other hand, it also suppresses people's opinion. Yeah, and with the digital technology now, it's really hard to associate even a small group. So that's a really big challenge for the people on the ground now. We have intimate connections with all of them. It's really a very dark time for them, especially with the new technology.
So you would say that this has fostered dissent and resentment and disassociation on all fronts, correct?
Yeah, but on the other hand, it does repress effectively. It's very difficult to organize now.
Thank you, thank you. Since 1997, Hong Kong has fostered respect for the rule of law, for human rights and personal freedoms as an autonomous special administrative region of China. However, China has aggressively sought to erode civil liberties in Hong Kong, including by harassing the operators of a museum commemorating the 1989 massacre. Professor Minsner, how can the United States support efforts to combat China's bullying tactics in Hong Kong?
That's an excellent question, and I think Congresswoman Wagner, you highlighted Hong Kong as an excellent issue to focus on, precisely because as the space erodes, as the space that once existed in China erodes, it's directly affecting Hong Kong as well. And it's not just sort of individual building of, it's the arrests of the book sale seizures of people in Hong Kong, bringing them into mainland China. It's the erosion of the norms with respect to electoral practices. It's this proposed extradition law that's going through. I certainly think congressional concern on this issue is something that at least triggers interest in Hong Kong, precisely because of Hong Kong's trade status.
Right.
The question is, what does that mean for Beijing? Is this something that's sufficiently, that I'm not entirely sure, but that's clearly, you're seeing delegations of folks from Hong Kong who are coming to the United States right now focused on this, and I would be expecting, to the extent that some of you are on the Foreign Affairs Commission, that's probably one of the top issues. That
And I want Beijing to know that we are watching what they are doing in Hong Kong very, very closely. I understand that China's concentration camps in Xinjiang province, where an estimated, as we've heard already, 1 million Muslim Uyghurs have been detained, are evolving now into a forced labor system. Mr. Wu Kai-shi, how can the international community deter the creation of a gulag in Xinjiang province?
Thank you, Mrs. Wagner. And I think, as I said earlier, there were time to express concern, there were time to make condemnations, there were time to harsher punishment, and then there are also time to know how to hurt your opponent. So when you know when they hurt, they react a little bit reasonably. Being 30 years living in exile as a political dissident, that's one important lesson we learned. Outside pressure works. But what is the outside pressure that would work today? The Chinese government have grown its ability, just like you just mentioned, to suppress the dissents within China with their enormous expenditure, and then also the confidence that comes from the international community. When a trade delegation goes to Beijing and to negotiate the access of a market and investment, and at the same time raise the question of human rights, but not waiting for an answer for it, that sends a very wrong message to the to the Chinese regime, and also, unfortunately, to Uyghur people too. So what I'm saying at this time, we have long passed the places that we should go like a condemnation. We have long passed that. Direct pressure on the people who make those decisions. I'm talking about Xi Jinping. I'm talking about the governor of the party chief of the Xinjiang Uyghur Autonomous Region, and apply the Magnitsky Human Rights Accountability Act seems at this point the only resort left for the United States. You said we are watching, you know what? Yes, I think Chinese
We need to be doing,
Yes.
is what you're saying. I thank you.
Yes.
China has begun implementing a vast social credit system, a dystopian system of punishments and incentives intended to encourage, quote, good behavior. Ms. Kalutil, how did Tiananmen inform the creation of the social credit system, and how is it being implemented?
I think in a broad sense, what Tiananmen served to illustrate for the CCP was that information was something that could be very powerful if used against them, but if managed properly, it could be a powerful asset as well. And so in the years following the Tiananmen Square massacre, I think the party was even more careful to try to put in place, well in advance, mechanisms that would guide the direction of information technology. When I was a reporter in Hong Kong, I saw this unfolding in the 1990s with the so-called golden projects. This predated the Great Firewall as we knew it, and then eventually evolved into it. And now what we're seeing with the social credit system, or systems, because they're still overlapping and not quite formulated yet, you do see a vision for social management that I think has been there from the beginning, but now the tools are gradually falling into place with which to implement it. I don't think that it's quite there yet. I think that a lot of what has been discussed about this system may not be fully implemented in reality, but simply understanding the intent is useful, I think, because there is really a large possibility of wide-scale harnessing of data to manage society in ways that we just haven't really conceived of yet. We're starting to see the outlines of that now, and I think were it to really be implemented both within China and elsewhere around the world, it would be a truly chilling for democracy.
It is chilling. My time has expired. Again, I thank all the witnesses for their courage and due diligence. I yield back.
Thank you, ma'am.
Mr. Johnson of Georgia.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I want to thank all of the witnesses for your appearance here today, especially Mr. Kai and Mr. Zhou. I am honored to have the opportunity to recognize each of you for your lifelong dedication to activism and your ongoing commitment to democracy and the protection of human rights. To the family and friends here today and watching from abroad who lost their loved ones on June 4th, 30 years ago today, in Tiananmen Square, I want to thank you for your tremendous commitment to advocacy and the courage that you demonstrate by continuing to tell these painful stories. And we mourn with you, and we will do our part to make sure that our country does not continue to slip into amnesia about what happened 30 years ago, as the Chinese people apparently have been lulled to sleep. The Center on U.S. China Relations released a report in February of this year entitled Course Correction Toward an Effective and Sustainable China Policy. And in that report, it was noted that the human rights situation in China has drastically worsened, and U.S. efforts to protect and advocate for human rights have become less effective. Mr. Kai, you mentioned about wealth concentration in China being among, you mentioned 200 top families. And I'll note that China has 12% of the world's billionaires are Chinese, and they control about $6.5 trillion in wealth. So while we've seen human rights get worse in China over the last years, during that same period of time, we've also seen wealth being earned and concentrated into the hands of the few. That is also something that's been taking place in other areas of the world, including America. What has been the impact of the concentration of wealth? Or do you see there's a parallel or a connection between the concentration of wealth and the decline of human rights in China? Mr. Kai, and I'd like to hear from the other witnesses on that question.
Sure. Thank you, sir, Mr. Johnson. That the Gini ratio in China perhaps is one of the lowest. That the division between poor and wealth is extreme in China, and then a financial institution from this country, Bloomberg, have calculated in the last 30 years of economic growth, and then often referred by the world as economic miracle, China economic miracle, that has accumulated much of a wealth, but a good 20–30% of the wealth of China that has accumulated in the last 3 decades went to 200 families. So it kind of provides a picture that you can see. A group of people, as I earlier described, stole the position of ruling this country and taking advantage of that position to loot the country. If that is the case, if they are a group of bandits and nothing more than a common thief, they will act like a common thief, which includes suppressing dissent, hammering down everyone who stick their heads up, because I think there's one lesson I think all human beings from throughout the cultures of this globe, we all know that there's no end to greediness. And
do you see amnesia about what happened to China as it was emerging as an economic powerhouse, and the suppression of human rights along with the concentration of wealth?
Yes, amnesia is a medical term that I kind of feel a little relented to use it, because amnesia is something you probably cannot really control. But then in China, it is systematic wiping out of all the informations, and then a lie, and then construct a new so-called communist version of the history. And with that, that's the sole purpose of Communist Party doing that, is again just to help them reassure their ruling position. So yes, it does have a direct link with, of course, human rights abuses. And then they are totally capable of doing that, and they don't care about the value that we're living by today. Thank you, sir.
I would like to add that the accumulation of wealth gives the Chinese authorities a very convenient narrative to the people. We are strong, we are powerful in the country, and if you do what we say, you will too become as strong and powerful as we are.
Follow up on that. I think your question is dead on. I think it's even deeper than just having a couple billionaires. Money and power flowed together, particularly in the 90s and the early 2000s, in very perverse ways. Essentially, money and power became linked together. Of course, some of it is, extremely billionaires, being in deep relationships with party elites. But even more than that, I also think, we often think that the rise of a middle class, somehow changes. It doesn't quite work that way. I think for many people, if you're an established urban resident in Beijing or Shanghai, your property value has gone up, you work for a state-owned enterprise, you see your livelihood tied up very much with the system. And one of the things that you're worried about is those migrant workers. You're worried about those others in society taking your stuff. And it's a very powerful incentive to sort of say, I'm going to work with the system. I'm not, why challenge it? Who knows what might happen if the cards got reshuffled? And that, I think, is an even deeper reason why, the situation in China itself as to how people view reform or political challenges is very complicated. And one of the main factors is, where do you sit in terms of your own personal wealth?
Mr. Zhou?
Mr. Chairman, can I have a question of order? The Tiananmen students are going to have a reunion in about 10 minutes in the office of Madam Speaker. So can we, Zhou Fengshuo and I, two of us being the student leaders, we would like to excuse ourselves from this hearing if it is. Who is the chairman at this time? I'm sorry.
Right.
Mr. Chairman, sorry.
The gavel from Senator Rubio.
Yes,
yeah,
yes.
That's fine.
Okay, thank you so much. And then I think the other experts here can give you great testimonies as well. And then I would like to take this opportunity to thank all the members of this very important audience. And Mr. Yoho, thank you very much for your supporting the Uyghur issues. Thank you. Okay.
Yeah. Okay.
Thank you.
I thank you, and I yield back.
Okay, thank you. The gentleman from Pennsylvania.
Thanks, Mr. Chairman. I was going to have a question for Mr. Kashi, but I think I'll probably just go on a rant here instead, since you're leaving. And I want to preface this by saying that any of my comments
because I sometimes get passionate. I want to make sure that there's no misunderstanding that my comments are about the communist government and not the Chinese people who are breathing to be free. And what we're talking about is the consequences. And Mr. Kashi, when you talk about how we abandon you, I think it's important when we talk about this anniversary, this commemoration of the events, the horrific events that happened 30 years ago today, that we go back a little further to that and recognize that we, the United States, abandoned its own principles. John Service, Harry Dexter White, working with FDR. We chose Mao. We chose Mao instead of Chiang. We chose communism and abandoned freedom. And it's important to recognize that, because these things can happen yet again today. The apologists for communism and totalitarianism work right within the halls of this government today. And they have for many, many years. And as I listen to my friends on both sides of the aisle, I feel like we're all in agreement here. And while I commend the makers of this legislation and this panel and the recognition of what has happened 30 years ago, and to keep that memory alive, and the efforts for which so much was sacrificed to keep those things alive, we must not stop at that, and we must recognize where we are. For every action that China takes in Tibet, there should be an action from the United States. In Taiwan, in Hong Kong, when they dump their products on the United States, when they steal our property, when they threaten their neighbors, when they send their Chinese students over here to spy on us and collect on us, there must be an action from the United States, more of an action than a resolution. China has been in a trade war, an economic war, a culture war, an information war for decades with the United States, and it is long time overdue that the citizens of the United States wake up to this fact. We must decide at some point whether we're happier with made in China all throughout our homes and all throughout our stores, if it's worth keeping that or losing the sovereignty of our nation over time to the Communist Party of China. With that, I think that Mr. Kaji talked about some concrete actions that could take place. For me, there are many more. I think we ought to recognize the government of Tibet in exile. I think we ought to establish a consulate in Tibet, in Lhasa. I think that we ought to close off the faucets and the access to the financial markets for the Chinese government, who launders dirty North Korean money through Wall Street. I think we could do a whole lot more, and I don't know what we're waiting for, but this is what I do know. From the sounds of it, most of the people up here, Democrat, Republican, left and right, are in agreement about how we feel about the Communist Party of China and what's good for America and what's good policy. What seems to be slowing us down right now is that we love our country, but we can't get past this president. And I would say to my friends on either side of the aisle, if you have an aversion to this administration, finally an administration who is doing something about the existential threat, the clear and present danger that is China, finally. Go on disliking him. Go on hating him if you want to, but love your country. I don't think the administration's doing enough, and so I would urge my colleagues on this side of the aisle and on that side of the aisle to, number one, support the administration where it's appropriate, when he's being tough with China, and number two, take the lead. Take the lead and say, these are the other things that we could and should be doing. The time is right now. It only gets worse from here. It only gets worse. And with that, Mr. Chairman, I yield back.
Thank you. The gentleman from Florida.
Do you go back and forth? Excuse me. Thank you for your courtesies. I am a member of the Tom Lantos Human Rights Commission, so my name is not here. It is Sheila Jackson Lee, and I thank the distinguished gentleman from Florida for yielding. I want to acknowledge the gentleman who had to go on to a meeting with the Speaker, and I also want to acknowledge the Speaker. All of us have been witness to the leadership that she has given to this issue, and how appalling it is that though she's been involved in this issue so very long, in 2009, she and a delegation were brave enough to go into Tiananmen Square and to unfold and honor those that lost their lives. I hope that we, and I'd appreciate all three of you answering in snippets, if you would, that we appreciate that lives were lost during that period of time, and that the cover-up did not help anyone. I want to say this. We are blessed with the body of Chinese Americans who are here in the United States, brave Americans who have fought in our wars, who are leaders in industry and education and social services and immigration work, and the friends of so many of us in our constituency and are our constituents. And I think this is where we have a severe problem. And that is that we have not, and I heard one of my colleagues said, we have not sufficiently educated the body politic that can help us. Certainly there are Chinese Americans who are from Taiwan who have certainly a different perspective. But we, most times in issues like this, the advocacy of the indigenous populations from that country who are now citizens can be very helpful. So I want to put that on the record and say that we have, I think, collectively not done a good job in doing that. The other is, I've been to Tibet, and it is now 2020, and we're still facing the discrimination of that. Falun Gong, many people know, whatever your agreement is, has also suffered religious discrimination. We don't know how many people are political prisoners or religious prisoners. So here's the question that I want to raise. How do we penetrate and increase the advocacy? The very fact that China has moved on an innovative development pathway, for example, the pathway to China, that's not the exact terminology. It's the second economy in the world. We're number one. They're fast approaching. They take pride in that. President Xi takes pride in that, which leads to not only the failures of this administration for a trade agreement, but obviously President Xi has his contributions to that. So the economy plays a heavy role in its image of everyone wanting to be China's friend. And at the same time, people are dying. We have to penetrate that. I'd be interested in your viewpoint on how we pierce that, and how do we raise the concern of Chinese Americans who are barons of industry here, who are leaders, and who, let me not label everyone, but whose voices are not heard, particularly on that issue. My last point is that what is being done to the continent of Africa is more than sinful. It is disgraceful. To the African presidents, you need to listen, that you are doing a disservice to the continent. You are taking resources, and none of it is translating to the vast numbers of Africans who are in need of partners. They're not in need of owners, and that is what's happening between China and Africa. Owners are trying to own Africa and not partner with Africa. I'd appreciate you answering those questions. Just the two questions about the economy. Thank you.
I can try to. I thought you made a very good point at the very beginning, which I sort of heard as a question. I'll respond to it because I think you made the point about the relations clearly between the United States and China are getting tenser, and they're going to continue to get more tense and deteriorate over the future. One of the key questions is for folks in power in the United States is, are the tensions between U.S. and China, the Chinese Communist Party, are the tensions between the U.S. and China as a country, are the tensions between U.S. and the Chinese people? What I heard both Congresswoman
Jackson Lee,
as well as a couple of the other members mentioned as well, is you underlined the point that this, the dispute right now is not with the Chinese people. There are voices in Washington right now that want to paint this as a civilizational challenge or something like that. I think we clearly have to resist that. That's not the America that we know. And it plays directly into the narrative that sort of an increasingly paranoid Chinese state is attempting to use to mobilize support among its own nationalistic support among its own people. So being very clear exactly with what our challenge is I think that's crucial, and I really appreciate that all of the folks that I heard speak here reiterated specifically what the American government's dispute is with. I'll stop there.
The other two witnesses, remember I said about Chinese Americans, how we get them engaged. Thank you.
I can say that I really appreciate that question, and I would also associate myself with my colleagues' remarks that we must clearly distinguish between the CCP and the Chinese people and people of ethnic Chinese descent all around the world. Unfortunately, it is a deliberate policy of the CCP to try to reach into those communities around the world and suppress authentic speech and discussion around CCP policies. And so essentially what we're facing is a global information environment in which there is preemptive closing of discourse, of free and open discourse and debate about CCP policies. So that is an incredibly tough environment in which to try to bring a more accurate message or more accurate information. When I was recently in Ghana for a series of meetings, a few interlocutors said that they had plentiful contacts between the Chinese government and their own societies, and then increasingly they saw their own paths as being framed as a divergence between essentially economic development or democracy. And that is in keeping with the China model that is being presented around the world, including in sub-Saharan Africa. Interestingly enough, those interlocutors, many of whom were active in the democracy and human rights space, said, this narrative is completely wrong. As we understand it, the choice is not between development and democracy, but between dictatorship and democracy. The model that's being presented is essentially a false choice, and we understand this, but unfortunately, the narrative that is being presented is so overwhelming, and it's being presented quite successfully, including through preempting alternative modes of discourse and alternative pieces of information, that it's very hard to get another message out there to talk about the fact that you are deciding between dictatorship and democracy, not development and democracy. And just to reiterate a point I made before, I think it's imperative upon the democracies who support more free and open discussion of CCP policies to really be there and to be present in that, and to not essentially simply through passive inaction allow the CCP to dominate the frames for debate within developing countries all around the world.
Thank you. Ms.
Mi-Ling Tsui. I think that the point that you raised about getting Chinese Americans involved in this country is an excellent point. I'm an immigrant, and among Chinese American friends, I tend to notice an attitude of, oh, you know, that's the Chinese government. What can you do about it? And I think that a lot of people have been conditioned, culturally conditioned, into the state of, oh, there's nothing we can do. The Chinese government is like that. And of course, that condition is politically exploited by the Chinese government. I think that one way to address it is that I ask my friends, we live in this country. We live in a country where we can exercise our fundamental rights to freedom of expression. While you avail yourself of this freedom, why can't we do more for the people in China?
Thank you. Thank you very much. Mr. Chairman, let me thank my friend from Florida for your kind yielding, and I look forward to all of us working on these issues together. I think the last witness has given us another effort in our own communities to work with Chinese Americans. So I thank you. As I close, let me acknowledge a young lady that's here with me, Mr. Chairman, Nyla Ersan, who is with the foster care program, shadowing us today. And she's sitting behind me, and we're just delighted that these young people are learning about civic government and democracy and the great work of Republicans and Democrats. This particular body is showing that we work together on crucial issues because we love our country. So I thank you for giving me the courtesy of yielding at this time. I yield back, and I thank the witnesses and those who were from Tiananmen Square, if you will, alum. Tragically, honor them as well today. Thank you. I yield back.
Thank you, Congressman Jackson Lee, and welcome. You get a great view from back there as well. Thank you. Gentleman from Florida.
Thank you, Senator. I appreciate it. Good to see you again. I want to start off with
a statement, and that is, China and Xi Jinping are highly insecure and paranoid as a country and as a leader. And they're paranoid and insecure of free-thinking people. The Communist Party cannot survive by a people that can challenge government. That is why Hong Kong, Tibet, the Uyghurs, Taiwan are a threat to them, and they can't be allowed to succeed in China's Communist Party's eyes because they are free-thinking. And for clarification, do people in China believe, as we do in this country and other Western democracies, the innate genetic makeup of people in liberty and freedom, the desire to be self-ruling? Do they believe that in China today?
It is hard to say because, as I mentioned earlier, that a lot of people have been culturally conditioned and politically exploited.
I understand that, but down deep inside, when you talk to people from China, do they believe in the same beliefs we do? Because if you plant an acorn, the way it's designed is the trunk grows up, the roots grow down. That's just the way we're designed. And I think people, if you believe in what we believe in, we have the desire to be free, self-determining, and we're blessed in this country that our founding fathers got it right. So that innate ability, when I've talked to people from around the world, I hear the same thing. Of course we do. Not what they're conditioned to do, but what they truly believe.
I can point to the example of Taiwan. People in Taiwan are Chinese people of Chinese descent, and they obviously thrive in a democracy.
Right.
So there is no essentialist point about the argument that Chinese people on the mainland don't believe in democracy.
Okay, I think it's true around the world. Realizing the mistake of the past administrations, I look at Nixon and Kissinger with opening up China. I look at Clinton with the WTO, hoping China would evolve into a modern, democratic, market-driven society. And it didn't happen. And so we have to change course today because China went from being a very bumbling, stumbling adolescent as they grew in wealth. They didn't know how wealthy they were, and then they came into puberty and their testosterone's kicked in, and they don't know how wealthy they are, how strong they are, and they're flexing that muscle to try to find out their place. What is the, in Tiananmen Square, and I appreciate the people that were here and you guys talking about this, there's a convicted activist, Dong Shengkun, in 1989, given a suspended death sentence on arson charges, and he spent 17 years in prison. A fellow protester in freedom, he said that he'd prefer to have his son think he's a regular criminal, at least in the current political climate in China, than be potentially put in danger by learning of his father's political past. It is for his safety, Dong said, I worry that I might influence his thought if I start chatting to him about those things. Other former political prisoners have expressed concerns about talking to their children about the massacre for fear of putting them at risk. This goes on, it says that 3 decades after the Chinese government declared martial law and unleashed the military on unarmed students and worker protesters, the bloodshed has been largely erased from the nation's collective memory. The Communist Party-led efforts has created a generation who are mostly unaware of the Tiananmen Square massacre. School textbooks don't mention it, and students won't find photos of stories on June 4th on China's heavily censored internet. So they're erasing history, just like they're doing with the Tibetans. They're going to do it with the Uyghurs. And I guess one of my questions I have, a direct question, is what is the estimate of the Uyghurs held against their wills in Xinjiang, or China in total?
The estimates, I think, vary in terms of. If you're asking about the number of the people who have been held in the political re-education camps that have been established since 2017, the estimates vary. The ones I've sort of seen most, about 10% of the population, hundreds of thousands to upwards of 1 million. Some people's talk.
I've got a paper here that says there may be up to 3 million.
I've heard that statement too. I don't know. It's a very large proportion.
If these are re-education camps, are people free to come and go as they choose?
No, this is compulsory.
It's compulsory. All right. How often are the armed crematoriums used? Any idea?
I don't know that.
All right. I found that very disturbing that when we read the advertisements for the guards for the armed crematoriums that must be physically fit and capable of fighting, it doesn't sound like it's a pleasant thing. And so I think we're seeing a repeat of history here. Moving on, I think what I see that needs to happen as a policy, because we want corrections, our trade policies, they need to change. And I lost one of my papers here. Our trade policies need to change. And what I propose for this country to do is to look at how we trade with China. I think we need to look at putting them in a tiered trading system, all of our policies. The best trading systems, they go to tier 1, they get the best deals. The ones that are less favorable, number 2, the minimal trade deals are at tier 3. And I think we need to put in all things, corruption of government, human rights conditions, and I think we should change that immediately. The other thing, and I'm going to end with this, Mr. Chairman, is that right now we have all of our manufacturers flocked to China. Fortunately, some of them are waking up. Our proposal that we've promoted for the last year and a half is to do the ABC policy, and that is manufacture anywhere but China. I know they've got a market of 1.3 billion people, but there's, last time I counted, I think there's close to 6.7 billion people outside of China. I would focus on that market, and I think if we get China's economic attention, I think we can help change the way they treat people and then knock them down on a tiered trading system. Until we do that, they're going to continue to grow, and I fear for what would be down the road. Mr. Chairman, thank you.
Thank you, Congressman Yoho. I want to thank the witnesses for coming here today for this commission and really help us reflect on what I think could be called a horrendous moment in history. I want to take a moment and express my sorrow for the men, the women, their families who lost their lives 30 years ago for standing up for what they believe in and trying to create a better world. I distinctly remember that day, as those of us who remember watching TV, watching Mike Chinoy there in Beijing with that one feed they had, CNN, and watching the horrors unfold in front of the entire world. As someone who spent over 5 years living in China, I was working in the private sector, an expat in Guangzhou. In fact, our 2 youngest children were born in Hong Kong. I've led multiple CODELs to visit China and some of the neighbors over the past 4 years. I've traveled to places across China, including Xinjiang province in Urumqi, to Tibet, seeing the Buddhist monks, to Dandong on the North Korean border. It's allowed me to see firsthand the human rights abuses, censorship, and the challenges the Chinese people face, as well as the efforts made to extend their influence beyond their borders. As your testimonies, this commission, the State Department Human Rights Report, and numerous others indicate, the state of basic freedoms in much of China is in dire straits. It's important we as a nation, founded on freedom, the rule of law, bring our influence to bear to stop the repression of basic human rights in China. Professor Mintzer, we've not seen a specific incident similar to Tiananmen in the past 30 years. But the Chinese government's resolve to repress basic freedoms is stronger than ever. How has Beijing changed their repression of basic rights from using traditional armies in 1989 to using advanced technologies today?
So I think with respect to that, sort of if you're asking about the evolution of repression, first I will point to some of the points that my co-panelists made with respect to the technological evolution in terms of more savvy control over media and over internet. That's one core aspect. I think the other thing to realize is that there has also been a large co-option. There are large segments of Chinese society that feel that their wealth and their livelihood is tied up with the system. And so that property values, their pensions. And I think that's another key source of, you don't need to repress people if people feel that the system is giving you benefits and is giving you a better life. And if you worry that the failure, that the collapse of the system would endanger your own livelihood. And so I think the combination of those two things is probably the most effective tools that the party uses to maintain control.
Do you want to add to that?
I would agree with those points, and that often those mechanisms of control, while they are connected to technology, can frequently take place within the wider swath of society, that it really relies essentially on intimidation and an acceptance of principles, self-censorship, so people don't express themselves. And the red lines that you're not supposed to cross sometimes are internalized. They're not necessarily solely expressed through the Great Firewall and so on.
Professor Mincer, are you aware of any dissent among China's leaders about China's violations of human rights across the country, and more specifically in Xinjiang?
You asked the question, any dissent among Chinese leaders themselves? None, no. I think that in terms of there is relative, it's a black box. We don't really know what's going on at the top. But I can't imagine, I haven't heard, and I can't imagine of any serious pushback with respect to those policies. I mean, the principle of China needing to have, Beijing needing to have a firm hand over society is very well established at the top level of the party. That being said, I do think there are rumblings. I think some of the more recent moves about, potential lifetime rule for Xi, the anti-corruption campaign, that's the type of stuff that does generate internal rumblings among top-level authorities because they're worried about their own possible future. But that's a very different question from exercising a heavier military and police presence in Xinjiang. People are on board for that, I think.
Ms. Shui, prior to arriving in Xinjiang in 2016, the Communist Party Secretary, Chen Guangzhou, was Communist Party Secretary of Tibet, where he pioneered a grid system of police management over urban areas, including the installation of hundreds of convenience police stations. How do Chen's policies in Xinjiang resemble those in Tibet? And how do they differ, and why?
I'm not an expert in Xinjiang, but my understanding is that he was chosen to go to Xinjiang precisely because of the successes he's had in Tibet. And so my understanding is that the surveillance is near total in the streets of Xinjiang. You actually see very few people who are there who are not supposed to be there. And I think that it's very unfortunate that that system has been working so successfully.
So Beijing continues to claim they're offering re-education centers to Uyghurs in Xinjiang, even going as far as comparing them to universities across the rest of the country. However, we know there's clearly a weak cover-up here going on as they're using it as a tool for repression. Could any of you share stories, if you had a chance here to share perhaps the most poignant story of what really goes on at these camps to help enlighten the public about the atrocities going on in the region?
I heard that Dokkan Issa, who is a Uyghur activist in exile, he lives in Germany. Last year, he found out about his mother's death 6 months after she had died. She had died in a re-education camp, and she was in her 80s. And the reason why he found out only 6 months later was that nobody in the family even dare contact him, because the act of contacting someone like Dokkan Issa would invite arrest and detention.
Any other comments?
I'm not an expert on this, but I would recommend that people watch the video stream of the event yesterday at the National Endowment for Democracy, which featured Dolkanisa talking about some of these experiences and also incorporated other experiences of people from Tibet and Xinjiang and other places.
Great. Thank you. Well, I've exhausted my time, and it looks like we've exhausted all the witnesses as well as the members here. And so anyway, as a sitting chair here, I'm now going to gavel out this meeting. Thank you for coming today. Thanks for your courage, and thanks for your articulate testimony. We're gaveled out.